Think modern cities are gross. Try living where streets were sewers, bread had bones, and the local doctor prescribed leeches and prayer. Welcome to the real Middle Ages. Take whatever modern city you're living in, New York, London, Paris, whatever. Now remove plumbing, trash, pickup, sanitation laws, deodorant, antibiotics, toothpaste, and human decency. Congratulations. You now live in a medieval town. The streets are narrow, the buildings lean like drunkards, and the whole place smells like a fermented toilet. Not a regular toilet, a shared one from a fraternity house, after a chili eating contest. People today freak out over a little mould on bread. In medieval towns, mould was part of the food pyramid. If it didn't crawl, it was edible. If it did crawl well, it might still be edible, just more crunchy. Food sat out in markets under the open sun next to pigs, dying chickens, and the occasional decomposing hobo no one moved for 3 days. Sanitary standards. Darling, they were as fictional as dragons. Let's talk population density, because medieval towns were about as spacious as a sardine can with walls. You've got people, pigs, beggars, and horses all trying to survive in a space the size of a modern parking lot. Personal space didn't exist. Want to sleep cool. You've got 3 generations of goat and fleas sharing your mattress made of straw and dreams. If someone sneezed in your general direction, your entire family was already dead. You know how modern cities have zoning laws, housing here, factories there, sewage way over yonder. Medieval towns had a different plan. No plan. You could find a tannery, aka a skin-boiling, urine-soaked nightmare right next to a bakery. Nothing says delicious morning bread like the scent of freshly boiled cowhide and fermented piss. And that's not an exaggeration. Tanneries literally used human urine to process leather. So yes, the same hands that baked your bread may have just wrung out a bucket of peasant pee. But let's be honest, the number one smell in a medieval town wasn't bread or leather, it was rot. Rotting food, rotting people, rotting everything. Corpse carts were common, and if you died and no one liked you, they might just leave your body to bake in the sun until someone tripped over it. In summer, the stench was so intense people stuffed herbs in their nostrils just to walk through the street. Lavender wasn't for fashion, it was for survival. You're probably wondering, how did people live like this and not all drop dead jokes on you? They did. Infant mortality was brutal. Life expectancy was shorter than a TikTok video. If you made it to 30 people, looked at you like Gandalf the White. And yet somehow they kept going, ploughing through disease-famine rats and sewage like it was just another Tuesday. Medieval resilience fueled by desperation and really bad air. Let's talk architecture, or as I like to call it, medieval Jenga. Buildings leaned into the streets like they were about to gossip with their neighbours. Upper floors jutted out like lazy elbows, making narrow alleys even narrower. And what lived in those cosy wooden homes? Oh, just a few million fleas, rats, and possibly the Black Death. Insulation never heard of it. Most houses were drafty wooden nightmares with straw roofs perfect for catching fire or catching lice. Ever visit a modern open-air market and complain about the fish smell? Now imagine that, but the fish is 3 days old, sun-baked, fly-covered, and sitting next to a butcher hacking meat, on a table wiped with what might have been someone's underpants. Medieval markets were sensory assaults. You didn't shop. You survived the experience, and you probably caught something while doing it. That ham might be rat. That cheese might be mostly maggots. Bon appetit. And hey, let's give a shout out to the medieval fashion scene. Clothes weren't washed often or ever. People wore the same outfit for weeks, sometimes months, until it basically peeled off. Underwear optional. Socks fancy. And remember, no soap, no detergent, no deodorant. Just layers of wool and sweat marinated in horse-dung air. It wasn't who are you wearing. It was what's that smell and why is it following you. Speaking of smells, animals were everywhere. Chickens, pigs, dogs, even cows wandered through town like confused tourists. There were no pet signs because everyone had animals whether they wanted them or not. Pigs ate trash. Dogs ate pigs. People ate whatever didn't bite first. The streets were ankle-deep in animal waste. Slipping in cow poop wasn't funny, it was just how your Tuesday started. There's a medieval myth that people were dirty because they didn't know about hygiene. Not quite. They knew. They just had zero resources to do anything about it. Bathhouses existed, but they were shared rare and often doubled as brothels. A warm soak might mean an STI and pink eye. And who had time to bathe when you worked sun up to sundown, got paid in barley and had 3 boils oozing on your back? So now when you complain about how dirty the subway is or how someone forgot to flush at work, pause. Take a deep breath of clean filtered air and give thanks. You weren't born in a time where your front yard was a sewage pit and your pillow had bedbugs with names. You weren't born in a time where bread could kill you, water could poison you, and air could haunt your dreams. You, my friend, were born after humanity discovered soap. And this is just the beginning. If you think medieval towns smelled bad, wait till you find out what they were walking through. Up next, the streets themselves welcome to the medieval version of a slip and slide, but with more diseases and fewer laws. Let's make one thing clear, the streets of a medieval town weren't streets. They were medieval-themed obstacle courses designed by a sadist. There was no pavement, no drainage, no sidewalk cafe where you could sip your overpriced latte and watch the world rot. Most streets were uneven, muddy ruts carved by cartwheels and years of foot traffic from unwashed feet and hooves. And when it rained, oh, honey, it didn't just rain water, it rained recycled regret. Think of your worst rainy day walk. Now add urine, horse crap, moldy cabbage, chicken feathers, vomit, and a generous helping of human waste. That was your typical medieval stroll to the market. One step too far into the sludge and congratulations, you now have trench foot before the trench even exists. Shoes. If you could afford them, great. If not, tough luck. Barefoot through excrement was basically the medieval version of grounding yourself to nature. Now here's a little visual for you. Imagine someone leaning out of their top floor window and yelling, "Garde l'eau." Sounds fancy, right? It's French for watch out for the water, except it wasn't water. It was a bucket of liquid sewage, human waste, or worse. People literally chucked their chamber pots into the street. You could be out buying turnips and bam, a bucket of medieval smoothie lands on your head. Garde l'eau was the original version of duck and cover. And the best part, that wasn't considered rude. It was just daily life. If you didn't shout a warning before tossing your pee bucket out the window, then you were the jerk. So in essence, medieval courtesy involved screaming about airborne feces. Miss Manners would be so proud. And if you were walking home drunk one night, may the gods have mercy on your face. Now let's talk about who cleaned this mess. Short answer, nobody. Slightly longer answer, muckrakers. These were the poor souls, usually poor by every definition, tasked with scraping the filth off the streets. But here's the catch, they only did it when it got really bad, as in corpses start sinking into the dung bad. And even then, most muckrakers just moved it from one spot to another. Street cleaning in the Middle Ages was like sweeping your trash under someone else's rug. Preferably their grave. Muckrakers used giant wooden shovels, rakes and carts to move literal tons of crap. They wore thick leather boots and coats that absorbed smells so deep even Satan would have gagged. There are records of cities paying these men with beer, stale bread, or the right to sell what they scraped up. Yes, medieval people actually bought manure sometimes for fertilizer, sometimes for tanning leather, sometimes for who knows why. Want to feel blessed today? You weren't born a 14th century poop dealer. And it wasn't just the roads. Open ditches lined the sides of streets to collect runoff, if by runoff you mean a smoothie of death. These ditches were called kennels, which is misleading because dogs wouldn't go near them. They were full of grey water, blood beer, sludge and mystery fluids that glowed in the dark if you stared long enough. During warm weather they bubbled like a witch's cauldron and attracted flies like celebrities attract scandal. Now imagine a horse tripping in one of those ditches. Boom, splash zone. You and your freshly bought maggot sausage are now baptized in the most ungodly liquid known to humankind. And guess what? You don't get to change your clothes. You own one outfit, maybe two if you're a rich guy with multiple shades of filth. You walk home dripping disease, your skin burning from acidic waste stew, and all you can do is pray the rats don't think you're dinner. Speaking of rats, let's talk about those little third agents of horror. The streets were their playgrounds. Mountains of trash made perfect breeding grounds. Food scraps, feces, corpses. It was a rat's buffet. They got so bold they'd walk between your legs while you stood still. Not run. Walk. Like they owned the place, which to be fair they did. Rats weren't just a nuisance, they were family. They lived in your house. They slept under your bed. They chewed through your shoes, your food, and possibly your face if you slept too deeply. Medieval people often named them, made peace with them, or just ignored them entirely. Because after all, there were worse things outside. At least rats didn't throw feces from windows. Let's not forget the animal traffic jams. Picture this, a narrow alley with a pig cart, 2 cows, 3 chickens, a merchant shouting about eels and a guy passed out in his own puke. That's your main street. Traffic rules. Nope. Lanes. Lowall. Street signs. What are those? Everyone just shouted louder than the other guy and hoped not to get trampled. And if you did get trampled, don't worry, someone might move your body next week. Then there was the rain. Rain turned filth into soup. A soup of sadness. Streets became rivers of rot flowing through alleys into homes and straight up your nose. There were no gutters. Water pooled where it wanted to, soaking into floors and foundation. If your house was low-lying, congratulations. You lived in a disease hot tub. Foot rot boils and skin infections were just part of the welcome package. But hey, maybe you were lucky. Maybe your town had a central drainage trench. Great. It usually led to the river, which also happened to be the source of drinking water, laundry and public bathing. So yeah, the same water used to clean your armpits also carried your neighbour's diarrhea downstream. The phrase "don't drink the water" wasn't a suggestion, it was a survival strategy. If you wanted to live past 25, you drank ale. Even kids drank beer. Water was for fools and corpses. Now, if you're thinking, surely they had laws to prevent this chaos, let me stop you right there. They did. They had laws that said don't throw poop in the street. Guess how that turned out? Let's just say enforcement was not a medieval strength. Half the laws were written by guys who owned the poop-throwing buildings. The other half were too busy dying of plague to care. So the town's cleanliness plan boiled down to "may the wind be ever in your favour." So next time you walk outside and complain about dog poop on the sidewalk, take a moment to reflect. At least you're not wading through a sludge river of feces and dead things. At least nobody dumped a bucket of hot pee on your head while yelling in medieval French. And at least your city's street cleaners don't sell the collected waste to local witches for potion making. We're just getting started, friend. The streets were disgusting, yes. But what happens when you enter a medieval house, spoiler, it gets worse. In part 3, we're stepping inside and bringing a very strong nose plug. Let's get one thing straight. If you had a working nose in the Middle Ages, it was both a blessing and a curse, mostly a curse. You couldn't escape the stench. It didn't politely wait outside the door. It was the door. It was the walls. It lived in the air, the fabric, the hair of your neighbours, and the very soul of your mattress. Medieval towns didn't just smell bad, they breathed bad. The olfactory experience of stepping into a medieval house was like being slapped in the face by a wet sock full of onions, goat sweat, and mild despair. There was no airflow, no windows worth mentioning. Just tiny slits for ventilation which mostly let in more flies and the occasional rat. Imagine a room with 7 people, 3 animals, a smoky fire pit, unwashed clothing, rotting food, and 1 very confused chicken. Now imagine living in that smell, every single day. What did people do about it? They got creative or delusional. Herbs, for example. Everyone clutched bundles of rosemary, lavender, or wormwood like they were ancient Glade plugins. Nobles stuffed them in their sleeves and their collars, sometimes straight up their nostrils. You weren't just accessorizing, you were surviving. It wasn't, does this go with my outfit? It was, will this stop me from vomiting when my uncle walks in? And then there were pomanders, little metal balls filled with spices and perfumes hung from belts, or carried by hand like nasal life rafts. Fancy folks paraded them around like air fresheners in a gas leak. If you were extra wealthy, you filled yours with musk ambergris and rose petals. If you were poor, you chewed mint and prayed. If you were middle class, you just got used to gagging quietly in public. The real MVP of medieval stench combat, however, was the plague doctor mask. You know the one creepy beak black robes looks like a haunted birdman. That beak wasn't for style. It was filled with herbs and flowers meant to protect the doctor from the miasma bad air that supposedly carried disease. Spoiler, it didn't work. But it made people feel safer, which is kind of like using a scented candle to treat food poisoning. But let's get technical. Why was everything so impossibly foul? For starters, people rarely bathed. It wasn't just laziness, it was fear. They believed water opened the pores and made you vulnerable to disease. So instead of bathing, they dry cleaned themselves with linen cloths. That's right. Rub-a-dub-dub with yesterday's shirt and call it hygiene. You didn't bathe, you blotted. And even when people did take a bath, they shared the water. Family style. First dad, then mum, then the kids, then the baby, then maybe the dog. By the time it reached little Timmy, the water looked like soup made of skin flakes and sadness. Hot water was rare and precious. Soap was rare and possibly possessed, and the smell didn't leave. It multiplied. Cooking smells didn't help. Kitchens were basically smoky pits where meat grease and whatever the butcher swore was edible all combined into one giant scent bomb. Fires were fueled by wood dung or peat, none of which smelled like lavender and dreams. The walls absorbed it. The clothes absorbed it. You absorbed it. You didn't smell like home. You were the smell of home, and homes weren't sealed. No insulation, no caulking, no weather stripping, just drafty boards leaking that sweet, sweet aroma of filth into the streets. Which meant every house added its own perfume to the collective town bouquet. Imagine walking through a medieval town square. One step smells like roasted mutton, next step burning hair. Step after that open pus wound. That was Tuesday. It got worse in summer. Heat intensified everything. Food rotted faster, wounds festered louder, and everyone sweated through their lice-infested clothing. Men smelled like old cheese and wet dog. Women weren't better. They just masked it with crushed flowers and denial. Children smelled like everything they stepped in, which was usually animal waste. Love was blind and medieval noses were forced to be. Public spaces were no escape. Churches smelled of mould incense and the breath of 100 unbrushed mouths chanting Latin. Taverns reeked of spilled ale vomit and desperation. Town halls had the unique scent of body odour mixed with ink and rat droppings. And if you thought the blacksmith's forge smelled like manliness surprise, it also smelled like burnt hair and blood from unfortunate accidents. You're probably asking, didn't anyone notice? Didn't anyone complain? Oh, they noticed. They just didn't know any better. This was baseline existence. Complaining about smell was like complaining about gravity. And if someone did smell good, that was suspicious. You were either a foreigner, a witch, or just super rich. Either way, someone was definitely side-eyeing you. Let's take a moment to appreciate the modern marvel that is deodorant. That tiny tube of aluminum-laced magic we take for granted. It didn't exist. In medieval times, the only deodorant was rubbing herbs on your armpits and hoping the fleas moved out. Body odour was a lifestyle. Personal scent was more signature than any perfume. Oh yes, that's John. Smells like onions and horse. The worst offenders were the sick. Illness had a smell, sweet rotting metallic. Wounds that never closed teeth that blackened and fell out breath that could peel paint. Medieval medicine had no antibiotics, no sterile tools, no clue. So infected limbs and open sores were just part of the atmosphere. doctors sometimes diagnosed by sniffing your breath. If it made them gag, congratulations, you were dying. Now let's talk beds. A medieval bed was a mattress filled with straw feathers or whatever they could scavenge. No sheets, no washing. After a few months, the mattress became a living entity, a mix of mites, lice mould and crushed dreams. You didn't just sleep in your own filth. You inherited the filth of every season before. Rolling over in bed was like churning butter made of skin oil. So how did people cope? They adapted. Their noses dulled. Their standards lowered. They sniffed less and sighed more. They married people who smelled exactly like they did. A good match wasn't about status or wealth. It was about finding someone whose stink you could tolerate in close quarters until death or the next plague did you part. Now take a deep breath of your sanitised, air-conditioned room. Smell that. Probably nothing. That, my friend, is luxury. Your home doesn't smell like a goat died in the floorboards. You're not fighting off nausea with a sachet of dried thyme. And if someone farts in your living room, you're allowed to kick them out. Medieval people envied your fart rights. But don't relax just yet. We've sniffed the air and it nearly killed us. But now it's time to chew. Coming up next, let's open the medieval fridge, if you can call a rotting barrel of meat in a dirt basement a fridge. Grab a clothespin. It's dinner time. Let's set the record straight. Medieval people didn't throw things away because there wasn't an away. There were no garbage trucks, no landfills, no friendly neighbourhood sanitation department waving from the curb. If you wanted to get rid of something, food scraps, broken pottery, rotten vegetables, your dignity, you just tossed it. Out the window, into the alley behind your neighbour's house or into the river. Boom. Gone. Out of sight, out of nose. Kind of. That stench of rotting cabbage and shame that lingered outside every window that was the trash can. Everyone lived above their own garbage pile. Composting wasn't an environmental choice. It was just what happened when you never moved anything and let nature chew on it. Rats were the janitors and maggots were your recycling crew. You didn't hire pest control, you fed them. Peasants and townsfolk lived side by side with their waste like it was an extra family member. It slept near them, grew with them, sometimes spoke to them when the wind blew just right. And the worst part, it wasn't even considered weird. Throwing bones into the street or scraping a mouldy crust into the gutter wasn't rude, it was normal. The road was everyone's plate toilet and trash chute all rolled into one. You know those quaint medieval villages you see in movies, with the cobbled streets and the flower boxes? Yeah. Now imagine that same street but ankle deep in rotten turnips, goat guts, and some guy's infected bandages. Don't forget the smell of fish left in the sun for 3 days next to a bucket of horse entrails. Medieval aesthetic was mostly flies and sadness. And oh, the fish markets! Sweet mercy. Fish was popular, sure. It was also cheap, fast rotting and never refrigerated. Waste from fish stalls, scales, bones, guts was flung into the nearest alley or open pit. Picture walking past a butcher's stall in July, the sun beating down on a pile of pig heads while a drunk man relieves himself into a wooden bucket nearby. You want a baguette with that. Now you might wonder, where did all the trash go eventually? Simple. Nowhere. It just stayed. It decomposed on the spot or got washed into rivers during heavy rains, or trampled into the earth by hooves and bare feet. Towns became literal compost heaps over time. Archaeologists today dig through layers of medieval city and find entire strata of filth compacted into the soil. Congratulations, humanity, you invented geological garbage. And let's not forget the animals. They were trash disposals with legs. Pigs roamed free eating everything. Chickens pecked at God knows what. Dogs scavenged and fought over carcasses. And cats, they didn't care. They just judged. Pigs especially were basically garbage collectors with tusks snorting their way through refuse piles, like nature's vacuum cleaners, except louder, smellier, and occasionally violent. Here's a fun fact: in some towns, pigs were banned from city centres because they kept eating babies. Yep, little kids toddling around near trash piles and then snap. bacon strikes again. So yes, in addition to being living trash munchers, pigs were also minor public health emergencies. But people kept them anyway because nothing cleaned up a fish carcass like a hungry hog. And while we're on the topic of biohazards, let's talk about the rivers. Rivers in medieval towns were supposed to be sacred, pure, the source of life. Instead, they were long, flowing trash chutes. Anything you didn't want to see again went straight into the water. Fish guts, spoiled meat, dead rats, dead people, and the contents of every chamber pot within a half-mile radius. Then they drank from it. Cheers. Picture this, you toss your chamber pot into the stream in the morning, your neighbour dumps fish bones in the afternoon, and by sunset someone's doing laundry. Right there, smiling through the smell. Next morning you draw a bucket of fresh water for soup. That, friends, is how you create a town-wide game of gastrointestinal roulette. If the water didn't kill you, your own immune system would file a resignation letter. Now let's discuss public waste pits. Think of them as the closest thing to a trash dump, but smaller, smellier, and wildly ineffective. Towns are designated pits where people could throw larger items or general refuse. These filled up quickly and were rarely emptied. Why? Because no one wanted that job. Digging through decomposing animal parts and rotting cloth wasn't exactly the dream gig. Even the muckrakers said, "Nah, I'm good." But the crown jewel of medieval waste management middens. These were pits dug behind houses or in courtyards filled with every kind of household waste imaginable. Think compost heap meets horror movie. Food scraps, human waste, broken pottery, sometimes whole dead animals, sometimes parts of people don't ask. They stank, they swarmed with flies, and they were considered perfectly acceptable. Just cover it with some straw and pretend you're a gardener. And remember, everyone lived right next to these festering mounds. You woke up stretched and opened your door to the warm scent of 5-week-old herring skin baking in yesterday's excrement. If you were lucky, the breeze carried it toward your neighbour instead. If not, well, tough luck. Close the door and hope your herbs haven't given up the fight. Let's not forget that trash back then included more than just food waste. Broken tools tossed, rusted weapons tossed, stained clothing tossed, dead pet tossed. The line between trash and treasure was razor thin. Sometimes people dug through other people's waste piles to find usable scraps. Recycling existed, but it was mostly sad, desperate, and involved a lot of rats. Now, in case you're feeling smug about our modern trash situation, maybe don't. Sure, we have bins, bags, trucks, and sanitary workers, but we also have landfills the size of cities' floating islands of plastic and microbeads in our sushi. So yes, medieval trash was visible, rank, and immediate, but at least they weren't melting the atmosphere with their takeout containers. Small victories. Still, there's something uniquely horrifying about a society where the official garbage plan was let gravity sort it out. And honestly, that was kind of their motto for everything. Poop gravity, trash gravity, corpses. Also gravity. Medieval infrastructure was just one long trustfall into decomposition. So next time you're annoyed about taking the trash out, remember you don't have to kick your way through a pile of bones, spoiled liver and toe fungus just to find the front door. You don't live in a town where the air smells like fermented socks and rat funerals. And you, dear reader, have the modern miracle of garbage pickup. Give your sanitation workers a hug, or at least don't yell when they block your driveway. And now that we've waded through mountains of filth, it's time to see what's for dinner. Spoiler, it's been sitting out since Tuesday and it might still be twitching. Buckle up. Next stop meat so rotten it fought back. Let's get one thing out of the way if you're the kind of person who sends steak back because it's slightly pink congratulations. You wouldn't have survived 10 minutes in a medieval meat market. Back then, food safety was a myth, and meat was a gamble. Not a fun casino gamble either, the kind where the slot machine spits out salmonella and dysentery. You didn't eat to enjoy. You ate to not die, and sometimes you still lost. In medieval towns, butcher shops weren't cute little storefronts with glass displays and hygienic gloves. They were more like horror movie set pieces with blood flies and screaming livestock. Most butchers operated out in the open, hacking, chopping and flinging questionable meat onto wooden slabs while dogs licked the blood off the cobblestones. If you didn't see visible organs or smell outright decay, that was considered high quality. 5-star cuisine peasant edition. Refrigeration. Try a damp cellar and the hope that winter comes early. Meat was hung in smoky rooms or salted until it resembled prehistoric fossils. Salt was expensive though, so was smoke, so most meat was just left out for hours, sometimes days, and sure, the surface turned grey and fuzzy, but you just scraped that part off, right? It's like exfoliating your dinner. And let's talk about what counted as meat. There were no boneless chicken breasts, no filet mignon. It was all the parts. Eyeballs, tongues, kidneys, intestines, hooves. If it was attached to the animal and didn't actively crawl away, it was food. In fact, the nastier bits were often considered delicacies because they were rare, and medieval people had the taste standards of a blindfolded raccoon. Sweetbreads. Translation neck glands. You're welcome. Then there were the sausages. Oh, the sausages. These were tubes of mystery filled with whatever didn't make it into the nice cuts. Blood-fat breadcrumbs, questionable spices, sometimes hair. If you were lucky, they were smoked. If not, they were sun-aged in the open air until they reached the ideal level of murderous. People ate them anyway. Why? Because hunger laughs in the face of hygiene. Let's not forget the flies. Flies were everywhere. They laid eggs in meat faster than a gossip spreads in a small town. Butchers swatted them lazily with whatever they were holding, usually a cleaver still covered in goat brains. And the customers, they just waved their hands and hoped the maggots weren't too big. If the meat didn't wriggle, it was a good day. If it did, you shook it off, like protein confetti. Markets had no inspections, no health ratings, no rules. You could sell meat off the back of a donkey and no one batted an eye unless the donkey was still bleeding. There were no gloves, no hand washing, and certainly no sneeze guards. If you were a butcher with both thumbs and minimal visible boils, people called you a professional. If your meat didn't kill someone that week, it was considered a rave review. And sometimes the meat did kill. Spoiled pork caused vomiting and hallucinations. Rotten beef gave you cramps so intense you could hear the angels giggling. Blood sausage made with tainted blood. Congratulations, you've got front row seats to medieval food poisoning starring you as the corpse. People literally dropped dead in the street after lunch. Medieval Yelp would have just been gravestones. Now let's talk preservation. Salting and smoking were the two main methods, but salt was expensive, so poor people got creative. They dried meat in the sun while flies laid eggs on it, buried it in ashes great for texture, or just ate it raw and hoped the Lord was watching. And sometimes the Lord was watching and immediately turned away in horror. Want to know a fun medieval trick for extending the life of meat vinegar? Just drown the whole thing in acidic sour wine gone bad and pretend it's marinated. Or boil it until it resembles flavourless mush, then drown it in herbs to hide the fact that your chicken expired last Tuesday. If you were especially unlucky, your stew meat still had parasites, which meant so did you. People didn't complain because they didn't know any better. Everyone had gut pain. Everyone had the runs. Everyone assumed meat was supposed to taste like regret. If something actually tasted good, it was suspicious, possibly witchcraft. If it didn't smell like death marinated in disappointment, you wondered if it had been stolen from the nobility. Let's not forget the creative presentation. Roasted swans cooked whole with feathers reattached for style. Hedgehogs stuffed with spices and baked like sad piñatas. Pies filled with live birds that flew out when you cut into them. These weren't everyday meals, but when nobles showed off, they really showed off. Nothing says opulence like a cooked peacock stuffed with more peacock. Meanwhile, the average villager ate pottage. Pottage was a thick stew of whatever was left meat scraps, grains, roots and herbs if available. It sat simmering in a pot for days, sometimes weeks, just absorbing layer after layer of bacterial mystery. You never washed the pot, you just kept adding to it. It was a living broth, a meat-flavoured time capsule, and let's not even start on fish. Fresh fish was rare unless you lived by water. Most fish was dried salted or so old it had developed a personality. Eel was common mainly because it looked like a meat rope and didn't rot quite as fast. But even then you had to cut away the green bits and hope the bones didn't choke you to death. Shellfish bold move, you might as well have licked a medieval gutter. Spoiled food wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Botulism, salmonella parasites, foodborne plagues. All of them thriving in the warmth of medieval kitchens. But people didn't know. They just called it bad luck or the devil's supper. Imagine dying because you ate a chicken leg that blinked at you. That was Tuesday in some towns. So the next time you send back a burger because it's slightly under, think of your medieval ancestors choking down meat that had been through 3 stages of decomposition before it even hit the pot. Think of them scraping mould off cheese, picking bugs out of sausages, and still saying air could be worse, because it was. Every single bite was a medieval dice roll with death. But don't worry, they had alcohol to wash it down. Because in the Middle Ages, nothing says digest this spoiled cow liver like a pint of beer with mysterious floaties. And on that note, it's time we talked about beverages. Spoiler water was just another way to die. Let's dive right into the cold, murky truth, literally. In medieval towns, drinking water was like playing Russian roulette with your intestines. And instead of bullets, the chamber was filled with cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and a dash of surprise plague. Water looked harmless, clearish, occasionally bubbly, but don't let that fool you. Behind that gentle trickle from the well was a swirling cocktail of human waste, dead animals, and the occasional toe. You see, sanitation wasn't a thing. Water came from wells, rivers, or public fountains, all of which were about as clean as a mud puddle in a dog park. Want to drink from the town well? Sure, just ignore the fact that it was dug 6 feet from the community cesspit. That's right. Human waste leaking into the groundwater like some kind of medieval smoothie. And if it wasn't the cesspit, it was the dead rat someone dropped in there last Tuesday. But hey, rivers must have been better, right? Nope. Not even close. Rivers were open sewers. You threw trash in them. You emptied your chamber pot into them. You washed your clothes and your dead uncle in them. Then you scooped up a nice big bucket of that same river to make soup. Delicious. Soup a la salmonella, served hot with a garnish of regret. And don't forget, animals drank from those rivers too. So if the bacteria didn't kill you, the animal poop floating downstream might give it a helping hand. Pigs bathed in it. Horses peed in it. Dogs waded through it, chasing fleas. Meanwhile, little Timmy is scooping up water for Mum's stew. Bon appétit. May your afterlife be less contagious. People knew the water was dodgy. They might not have understood germs, but they weren't idiots. If every time you drank something you got explosive diarrhea and saw God in the privy, you started putting 2 and 2 together. That's why beer and ale became the lifeblood of medieval Europe, not because people loved to party, but because boiling made it safer than the water. Children drank beer. Monks drank beer. Nuns absolutely. Jesus might have turned water into wine, but medieval peasants turned water into survival strategy. And before you imagine beer as your modern hoppy IPA, it wasn't. It was weak, cloudy, sour, and tasted like soggy bread filtered through a goat's sock. But it didn't kill you, which was all anyone cared about. You didn't drink to enjoy. You drank to not die. Hydration was a risk-reward calculation. You either lived tipsy or died thirsty. Sometimes they flavour their drinks to make them less disgusting. Herbs, fruit peels, even vinegar. Anything to disguise the taste of liquid despair. Mulled wine wasn't just festive, it was survival. Spiced ale, medicinal. Mead expensive. Yes, but slightly less likely to contain a drowned squirrel. A good drink didn't just warm your soul, it sanitized your insides. Let's talk about the public fountains. They were supposed to be clean water sources, but that depended entirely on how the water got there. Gravity-fed from springs may be okay. But most ran through lead pipes, stone troughs, or just sat there in big basins where anyone could toss in a fisher rag or their emotional baggage. People washed wounds in those fountains. They cleaned fish. They bathed their babies. Then the next person filled a bottle to drink. Cheers to shared experiences and shared bacteria. Even rainwater wasn't safe. Sure, it fell from the sky, pure and angelic, but then it landed on roofs covered in bird droppings, moss and mould. It ran into wooden barrels that hadn't been cleaned since the last plague, and by the time it hit your cup, it was just another microbe festival. Rainwater collection was a gamble. But hey, if you were lucky, maybe the dead pigeon floating in it kept the cats away. Boiling water helped. But firewood was expensive, and boiling took time. Most people didn't bother, they'd rather just roll the dice. Boil your water was the medieval version of go to therapy, a great idea no one had time or resources for. So instead they diluted wine with water, and hoped the alcohol would do the Lord's work. The wealthy had a slightly better setup. Castles often had their own springs or deep wells, though even those weren't foolproof. A siege could poison your water faster than you could say siege dysentery. Plus lead pipes were common among the rich. So while the peasants were dying of E. coli, the nobility was slowly going mad from lead poisoning. A quality medieval style. By the way, if you ever time travel back to the Middle Ages, do not drink the water. I don't care how thirsty you are. Lick a rock, eat snow, suck moisture from a leaf. Just do not drink what's in that bucket labelled clean. It's lying. That water has a body count. And if you got sick from water, which let's be honest, you would, good luck getting help. Medieval medicine would probably prescribe leeches of prayer and more water. You go to the doctor for stomach cramps and leave with a hole in your arm, and a recommendation to avoid sin. No hydration, no medicine, no hope. Just another name added to the long soggy list of water-related casualties. It wasn't just the drinking water that was cursed. Bath water was just as bad. If you were rich enough to afford a bath, you reused the water over and over. It got darker with every sibling, cousin or servant who stepped in. People compared the cleanliness of bath water to ink and ink, usually one. Imagine rinsing your face in something that looks like weak stew and smells like gym socks. So people stopped bathing altogether. Water was poison, bathing was risky. Better to stay dry and rank than risk disease. This led to all kinds of creative hygiene alternatives, perfumes, powders, linen rubs and denial. The smell became part of the culture. If I smell bad, at least I'm alive was practically a motto. If you smell too clean, someone might accuse you of sorcery. Let's not forget the animals who also needed water. Horses, cows, pigs, all drinking from the same troughs as children. There were no separate fountains for humans and beasts. Everything shared everything. Drinking from the same barrel as your mule was normal. No one blinked. It was like Noah's Ark, but thirstier and significantly more unsanitary. And in winter, forget it. Water froze. Wells dried up. People drank snowmelt when they could find it. Sometimes they resorted to melting ice from gutters. You haven't lived until you've tasted roof water that's filtered through bat guano and rotten leaves. It builds character. And tetanus. Despite all this, people adapted. They found ways to live. Not well, but long enough to produce more people who also feared water. Eventually, humanity figured it out. We invented plumbing, filtration, sanitation. But it took centuries of painful stomach-turning trial and error, and a whole lot of diarrhea. So the next time you fill your stainless steel bottle with filtered spring water and complain about the taste pause, remember the guy in 1320 who drank from a frog-infested puddle and called it Tuesday. Remember that your toilet flushes your shower works, and your cup doesn't double as a medieval biohazard. Whisper a quiet, grateful thank you to science. But don't get too comfortable, because next we're heading to the communal bathtub, the medieval germ jacuzzi. Pack your herbs and hold your breath. It's bath time. If you've ever complained about your gym's hot tub being a little cloudy, allow me to introduce you to the medieval public bathhouse, where water clarity was just a rumour and sharing body fluids was a team sport. These weren't luxury spas. These were cauldrons of communal stew, bubbling with hopes, dreams and skin flakes. Imagine a bunch of strangers, all of whom haven't bathed in weeks, climbing into the same wooden tub. Welcome to the original soup of the day peasant broth. Now, to be fair, medieval bathhouses weren't always gross. At first they were seen as civilised. The Romans had made bathing a whole architectural movement, beautiful stone structures, flowing hot water mosaic floors. The medieval version was less glamorous. A large wooden vat may be heated with rocks, or a fire pit shoved into a room that smelled like steamy armpits and wet wool. And if the Romans gave you colonnades, the medievals gave you trench foot. Everyone used them: peasants, merchants, nobles, and travelling disease vectors. Men and women often bathed separately, but not always. In some towns, mixed bathing was the norm, and by norm I mean naked chaos. Picture 6 adults crammed into a lukewarm barrel trying to ignore each other's boils while a guy in the corner trims his toenails with a knife. If that's not intimacy, I don't know what is. Privacy. Nope. You're in a room with strangers. No curtains, no walls, no shame. Bath attendants. Yes, that was a job might pour water over your head, scrub your back, or hand you a bar of soap made from old bacon grease and witchcraft. If you were lucky, you got a bench to sit on. If not, enjoy squatting in the corner like a wet medieval goblin. Modesty was a luxury and towels were mostly theoretical. But wait, it gets more fun. Bathhouses weren't just for bathing. They were also for socialising, gossiping, doing business, and in many cases other business. Many bathhouses doubled as brothels, turning your weekly scrub into a full-on medieval date night. Picture this: you're trying to wash off your day's collection of lice and fish guts, and the person next to you leans over and whispers, "So, you come here often. Romance is dead." Not in the tub, my friend. This blending of hygiene and hedonism earned bathhouses a sketchy reputation. The church hated them. Too much nakedness, too much pleasure, too little suffering. There were sermons about how bathing led to sin, how water lured the body toward lust. Which, to be fair, was sometimes true. Nothing says temptation like warm water and 14th century nudity. Eventually, authorities cracked down. Bathhouses were regulated, restricted, or shut down altogether. Cleanliness, it turns out, was a gateway drug. Now let's talk about the water itself. Remember, there was no plumbing. Water was hauled in by bucket or diverted from nearby rivers. Yes, the same rivers used for laundry, sewage, and the occasional corpse drop-off. Once filled, the tub was heated and reused all day. There were no filtration systems, no chlorine, no magical fairy that cleaned the bath between users. What you soaked in was mostly skin cells, sweat, dirt, and bits of regret from the guy before you. If you bathed early, you had a chance at something resembling clean. If you bathed late, you were essentially marinating in medieval people juice. Some bathhouses tried to maintain standards, draining and refilling the tubs occasionally. But let's be honest, water was precious, firewood was expensive, and people had already accepted a lifestyle that included plague as a house guest. So yeah, bath stew for everyone. Diseases? Oh yes. Bathhouses were petri dishes without the glass. Skin infections, fungal outbreaks, and the occasional plague flea were all part of the package. Got a weird rash after your soak? That's called sharing. Congratulations. You now have the itch, which could mean anything from eczema to early-stage death. Doctors might recommend herbs, leeches, or prayer. Mostly prayer. But here's the real kicker: despite all the filth, people loved bathhouses. They were warm. They were social. They were sometimes the only place you could sit in hot water and forget the rat-infested nightmare outside. For one glorious hour, you weren't a peasant covered in pig dung. You were a glistening naked person, probably with boils, but still, a person. Medieval self-care at its finest. Even nobles who had private tubs sometimes ventured into public baths for the social scene. They had servants boil the water, sprinkle in herbs like thyme and a rosemary, maybe toss in a rose petal or two for flair. But even the richest couldn't fully escape the reality everyone was sharing the same wooden bucket of humanity, just with better seasoning. And bath etiquette surprisingly complex. You didn't splash, you didn't stare, you didn't talk about people's warts, and you definitely didn't pass gas in the tub unless you wanted to be publicly shamed or possibly dunked by the entire group. One chronicler even described a brawl breaking out because someone moistened the bath rudely. Interpret that however you like. I'm not Googling it. Of course not all towns had bathhouses. Some people bathed at home using small barrels or basins. These were slightly more private, slightly less filthy, and slightly more likely to collapse under the weight of disappointment. Water still had to be hauled and heated. Soap was still lard mixed with lye, and once the water cooled, enjoy shivering in your own filth. You wanted a luxury spa, you got a damp box and a prayer. Eventually, as bathhouses declined, so did bathing. People began to fear water again, not just because of disease, but because of moral panic. Clean skin was associated with vanity. Dirty skin, humble, holy, down to earth. By the late Middle Ages, the truly devout sometimes bragged about not bathing for years. Saints were described as having holy dirt. Pilgrims wore the stink of travel like a badge of honour. Hygiene became a sin, and filth became fashion. And then came the plagues. Bathhouses already under suspicion were blamed for spreading disease. More closures, more sermons, more people walking around with the hygiene of a rotting onion. Soap use declined, public bathing became rare, and by the time the Renaissance rolled in, Europe was a continent of perfume-clouded, unwashed optimists who had given up on cleanliness entirely. So yes, public baths were gross. But they were also, paradoxically, the cleanest thing many people experienced all month. They were warm, communal, and briefly comforting, even if you had to share them with 15 strangers, 4 diseases and something floating near your ankle that may or may not have been sentient. You went in dirty, came out slightly rearranged, and probably contracted something new. But for a brief moment you were refreshed. Next up, though, were leaving the tub and heading to the toilet. Or more accurately, the horrifying medieval absence of one. Hold your nose and watch your step, things are about to get disturbingly splashy. If you think your office bathroom is bad, just wait until you meet its great-great-great-grandparent, the medieval toilet. The only thing more shocking than how medieval people used the bathroom was the fact that they often didn't. Not properly, not privately, and definitely not hygienically. The concept of a toilet as we know it, a private porcelain throne in a tiled temple of dignity, simply didn't exist. Instead, medieval plumbing was a tragic mix of Hull's gravity and blind optimism. Let's start with the royal version. The castle garderobe. Sounds fancy, right? It's not. A garderobe was a small cold stone room with a hole in a wooden bench. You sat, did your business, and let it fall directly into the open air down a chute that usually emptied onto the side of the castle wall or into a moat. Yes, the same moat that theoretically protected you from invaders was often a festering ring of feces. Nothing says fortified stronghold like a wall streaked in royal excrement. And it wasn't just about falling. Sometimes the chute went straight down to a cesspit, which was essentially a stone-lined hole filled with human waste. No flushing, no maintenance, just decades of slow, steamy fermentation. These pits had to be emptied by professionals called, wait for it, gong farmers. Their job was to climb down into literal pools of sewage, shovel it into buckets and haul it away. And you thought your job was soul-crushing. Gong farmers were usually paid well because their job was so revolting no one else would do it. They worked at night, wore heavy leather clothes soaked in filth, and had to be careful not to pass out from the fumes. Occasionally one would fall in and never come back out. That's right, death by poop. A truly medieval send-off. St. Peter. What brings you here, son peasant? I slipped in the Duke's cesspit. Glorious, but castles were the luxury option. Most people didn't live in castles. They lived in towns, and their toilets, if they had any, were wooden boxes over holes dug in the yard. These outhouses, often called privies, were shared by multiple families and rarely cleaned. The smell was permanent, the flies were loyal, and during winter your butt froze to the seat. In summer the contents practically boiled. Welcome to the seasonal poop experience. And then there were bridges. You heard me. In many towns, public toilets were simply holes built into bridges. You'd walk up, drop your trousers, and let nature take its course directly into the river below. If you've ever walked under an old bridge and thought, "Wow, this feels dangerous," medieval people agreed. But instead of fearing structural collapse, they were worried about getting hit by a surprise turd from above. Talk about a splash zone. Toilet paper, adorable concept. Wiping in the Middle Ages was an exercise in creative problem-solving. People used moss hay leaves, their hand, or pieces of fabric if they were rich. Sailors used ropes dipped in seawater. Some monks allegedly used smooth stones. None of it was comfortable and none of it was sanitary. Honestly, wiping was the least of their worries. Most people just wanted to survive the act of going without falling in. Now imagine you're a child in this world. You don't have a high-quality outhouse. You squat in the yard behind a fence or over a wooden board balanced on a ditch. One wrong step and you're ankle-deep in yesterday's dinner. There were no diapers, no potty training charts, no baby Björn toilet seats. Just the cold reality of open defecation and the haunting fear of splinters. Public sanitation laws technically existed, but only in the same way. Don't murder people existed regularly ignored. In some towns, laws were passed forbidding people from dumping chamber pots into the streets. Good luck enforcing that. Most people didn't have the luxury of indoor waste removal, so the solution was simple: throw it out the window and yell a warning. Garde low, they'd scream. Translation: watch out for the water. But it wasn't water. It was 14th century diarrhea with velocity. There were entire alleys that reeked like open sewers because they were. Waste would collect in ditches along the streets and flow or fester depending on the weather. During heavy rains, streets transformed into brown, bubbling rivers of shame. During droughts, the waste dried out and turned to dust that blew into homes, food, and mouths. There was no safe season. Every breath was a gamble. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, let's talk nighttime. There were no lights, no street lamps, no flush buttons. If you had to go at night, you used a chamber pot, a small bowl or bucket kept under the bed. You'd do your business in the dark, often half asleep, sometimes missing entirely. Then in the morning, someone, usually the youngest or poorest in the household, had to carry that sloshing bucket through the home, out into the street and dispose of it. Hopefully without tripping. Now let's imagine being sick in this era. You've got food poisoning, plague dysentery, or worse. You're stuck in a tiny one-room house with 10 other people, and the only toilet is a bucket, a trench, or the outdoors. The mess, the smell, the horror, it didn't matter. You didn't have the luxury of privacy or pity. You just hoped your neighbours wouldn't curse your name when the wind shifted. Medieval people coped the only way they could: denial and nose plugs. They burned incense. They hung herbs from doorways. They sprinkled lavender and rosemary to cleanse the air. But the smell of waste isn't shy. It seeps, it lingers, it follows. And in the tight alleys of medieval towns, it mixed with body odour, rotten food and disease. The result: a scent so powerful it could kill the appetite and possibly small animals. And here's the best part: medieval people didn't think they were dirty. To them this was normal. You lived with your filth, like you lived with your family, close, messy and unavoidable. People who insisted on bathing too often or being too clean were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Why is he always scrubbing himself? Must be hiding something. Yes, like basic human dignity. Meanwhile, the nobility who had marginally better options still weren't exactly pristine. Fancy toilets with cushions were just as unsanitary, just slightly more decorated. Some nobles used perfume-soaked cloths to wipe. Others installed toilet chairs in their bedrooms, essentially a throne with a hole. Because what better way to assert dominance than defecating in luxury, while your servants waited outside with a scented rag and a dead-eyed stare? Eventually things got slightly better. By the late Middle Ages, some towns had rudimentary sewage channels in efforts to clean waste pits. But let's not kid ourselves. It was still a poopocalypse. A medieval toilet wasn't just a sick joke. It was a daily exercise in humility, desperation, and ankle stability. If you didn't fall in, get infected or puke, you were having a great day. So next time you sit on your porcelain seat, push a button and watch everything disappear forever, take a moment. Thank your ancestors for crawling through centuries of fecal misery so you could enjoy your TikTok scroll in peace. Because once upon a time, in a town not so far away, someone's poop was falling off a bridge aimed directly at the head of destiny. Coming up next, rats, lice and fleas, because if the toilets didn't get you, the roommates surely would. Let's be brutally honest, medieval towns weren't just full of people. They were full of things living on people. If you had a pulse, you also had passengers. The pestilence parade wasn't a metaphor, it was a daily infestation. No one marched alone. Every man, woman and child had a personal marching band of fleas, lice. And if you were especially fancy, a rat or two trailing behind like unpaid entourage. Let's begin with the rats, those scruffy little survivors who turned entire cities into disease buffies. Rats were everywhere. In the walls, in the food storage, under your bed, and sometimes just on you. They were the true landlords of medieval towns. Humans paid rent in crumbs and garbage. Rats accepted. Silently. Graciously. And occasionally with plague. Black rats, the notorious plague carriers, weren't just nuisances, they were biological weapons with paws. They multiplied faster than hope could die and brought along their best friend's fleas. These fleas weren't just itchy little annoyances. They were loaded. Bubonic plague bacteria hitched a ride on them like tourists in a death-themed gondola. One bite and congratulations, you've joined the Black Death loyalty program. But the plague wasn't the rat's only gift. They also chewed through clothing, devoured food, left droppings everywhere, and occasionally bit people in their sleep. Waking up to a bloody toe and half a loaf of bread missing wasn't unusual. It was Tuesday, and poison traps, pest control, please. Medieval rats laughed in the face of human effort. Cats helped a bit, but cats also spread fleas, so it was a choose-your-own infestation scenario. Meanwhile, lice had no time for dramatic entrances. They were always there. In your hair, in your eyebrows, in your pubic region, hello crabs, in your bedding, in your soul. They thrived in wool clothing, straw mattresses and poor decisions. You could shave your head, sure, but guess what? They'd just move into your hat, or your shirt, or your child. Lice weren't picky. They just wanted blood warmth and a place to poop, and your scalp 5 stars. People coped by scratching. Constantly. Everyone itched all the time everywhere. If you weren't scratching, people assumed you were dead. In fact, there were entire jobs devoted to picking lice off nobles. Servants would comb through their master's hair like medieval primates inspecting for little jumping dots of doom. And then get this, they'd crack the lice between their thumbnails. Right there, mid-conversation. Nothing says good morning like an audible insect pop. And if you were really lucky, you had fleas too. Fleas didn't care who you were. They feasted on kings and beggars equally. And unlike lice, they could jump. So once you brought one home, they threw a party on your floor and invited the entire family. Flea bites weren't just itchy, they were tiny portals to madness. Clusters of swollen red welts that burned like tiny medieval curses. And remember, some of these bites carried the plague. So scratching wasn't just annoying, it was Russian roulette with fingernails. Clothing didn't help. In fact, clothing was the problem. People didn't wash their garments often, or ever. Undergarments were worn for weeks, sometimes months. Layers upon layers of wool and linen created the perfect breeding ground for bugs. You basically wore a bug hotel. The longer you wore it, the more it wriggled. Some outfits could practically walk on their own. Mattresses hilarious. They were straw sacks, musty, flea-ridden, and soaked in whatever life threw at them. Changing bedding was rare. Burning bedding was more common, usually after someone died on it. You didn't sleep on a mattress. You sank into it. Into the bugs, into the smells, into the weird wet spot you swore wasn't there last week. Let's not forget about scabies. Ever had mites burrow under your skin and lay eggs that make you itch like you're turning into a werewolf? That's scabies. They were common, especially in children, spread like wildfire through schools, homes and brothels. And guess what the treatment was? Sulfur. Rubbed directly on your already inflamed skin, smelled like death and felt like regret. But hey, you probably deserved it. You did sit on that public bench last week. You're probably wondering, didn't anyone try to fix this? Oh, sweet summer child. They tried. They powdered their wigs. They smoked their clothing over fires. They hung herbs around their necks. Some even sprinkled ashes in their beds to dry out the bugs. But lice didn't care about rosemary. Fleas didn't respect sage. They were medieval. They were relentless. And they were winning. Occasionally entire neighbourhoods would light bonfires to cleanse clothing. People would hang blankets over the smoke and hope the bugs choke to death. But more often the humans just got smoke inhalation and coughed their way back into infested beds. There was no real solution, just coping, just scratching, just endless buggy cohabitation. And let's not forget the psychological toll. You never felt clean. You never were clean. Your body was not yours. It was a buffet, a hotel, a transit system for creatures with too many legs and too little mercy. Every itch was a mystery. Every night was a lottery. Would you sleep through the bites or wake up flailing? Would that lump on your leg grow teeth? Children were born into it. They grew up crawling through fleas and lice like they were learning to swim. Parents didn't scream at bugs. They just shrugged. They'd seen worse. Bubonic plague had lowered the bar for what counted as concerning. As long as your kid wasn't coughing blood, a few bugs were no big deal. Childhood resilience medieval edition. And now, imagine being sick on top of all that. You've got a fever, you're vomiting, you're covered in boils, and on top of it, lice are eating your scalp and fleas are tap dancing on your ankles. Medieval hospitals, if you can call them that, were already nightmare fuel. Add the pest parade and you're in a biological opera of suffering. The chorus is made of itching, the aria is dysentery, and the finale is usually death. So let's pause and say thank you to modern pest control, to bug spray, to shampoo, to laundry, to sheets that don't wriggle, to the miracle of lying down without fear of being devoured by things the size of sesame seeds. Because if the medieval world had a motto, it was this: you are never alone. The bugs are with you. Next, we'll step deeper into the disease chamber, into the breath wounds and leaky organs of medieval medicine. That scent you smell, that's not incense. That's your last hope fading through a plague mask. Take everything we've covered so far, the trash, the rats, the poop rivers, and now mix it with the sour breath of a dying man who hasn't seen a toothbrush in his lifetime. Congratulations. You've just unlocked the next horror of medieval towns, the smell of disease. It wasn't metaphorical. It was chemical warfare waged in your nose. Illness in the Middle Ages had a scent, and once you smelled it, it lived in your nightmares. Before germ theory, people believed disease came from bad air known as miasma. And to be fair, they weren't completely wrong. Most of the air was bad. A whiff of plague breath or a stroll through an infected alley could practically knock you unconscious. The breath of a fevered man reeked of rot. The body of a woman with infected wounds carried a bouquet of pus, decay, and mouldy meat. Every house with a sick person became a scented candle from hell. Doctors, or at least guys pretending to be doctors, relied on scent for diagnosis. You didn't need a stethoscope when someone's skin was leaking. Infections were described by odour sweet and sickly, sharp and sour, or like rotting apples if the apples were made of regret. Wounds weren't just red and swollen, they gurgled, they hissed, they smelled. If your leg injury stopped smelling, it was either healing, or the limb was too dead to care. And don't even get started on the plague. The Black Death wasn't just deadly, it was aromatic. Victims' bodies would blacken with necrosis, their lymph nodes would swell into pus-filled balloons, and their breath could stop a conversation at 20 paces. The phrase "he stinks of death" wasn't poetic, it was observational. Corpses lined the streets stacked like grim lasagna, and each one added a new layer to the town's miasmic atmosphere. Inside, home's illness turned already cramped spaces into fetid ovens. Picture a room with 3 family members coughing blood, 2 goats eating their bedsheets, a pot of spoiled cabbage stew and no windows. Now add a man with gangrene being bled by leeches into a wooden bowl. That smell, that was your home. That was normal. You didn't light a candle. You burned the candle and hoped it fought back. Public hospitals, such as they were no better. Think warehouse for dying people. Rows of straw beds filled with the moaning the infected and the absolutely doomed. There were no antiseptics, no soap, and no concept of sterilisation. If someone had open sores, they were left a crust over while flies buzzed around like tiny grief counsellors. The air was thick with sweat, fear, and pus. The floor was soaked with liquids. Unnamed, unclaimed, unholy. Nurses, bless their souls, tried their best. They used herbs to master smell, vinegar to wipe wounds, and prayer to hold back the tide. But nothing could overpower the stench of 10 rotting humans sharing one bucket. You didn't visit medieval hospitals to get better. You visited to lie down and stop moving. Healing was a miracle. Hygiene was a rumour. Hope was a luxury. And if you were rich, you didn't go to a hospital. You brought the doctor to you. Of course, the doctor was often just a barber with knives and a strong stomach. He'd examine your urine, yes, by smelling it. Check your stool, yes, by holding it. And make medical decisions based on how many humours he believed you had out of balance. You might get prescribed a mixture of honey and pigeon droppings, or goat bile, or powdered mummy. Don't ask. These home visits didn't smell any better. In fact, they could be worse. Rich homes had the added benefit of exotic, rotting food incense and sometimes dead peacocks lying around as decor. Add a screaming child with a tooth infection, and a pile of leeches slowly escaping their jar, and you've got a Renaissance rave for your senses. Only no one's dancing. They're just dying in silk robes. By now you might be thinking surely there was some kind of standard, some official way to control the rotten reek. Well, not really. Cities tried, there were orders to clean up the dead, to limit public executions near food markets, a wise move to bury bodies deeper. But when 200 people died in a week from plague, there wasn't enough manpower or ground to keep up. Mass graves were dug and filled so fast the earth didn't have time to process its grief, nor its odour. Sometimes they burned incense in churches during services, not just for spiritual ambience, but to combat the smell of the congregation. Hundreds of unwashed bodies huddled together in fear of divine judgment and open sores. Light the frankincense. Light all of it. Throw in rosemary, sage, even cinnamon if you could afford it. But the moment the doors opened, the wind just swept in the disease cocktail like it had RSVP'd. And let's talk about post-death odour. Corpses weren't always removed immediately. If you died at home, your body stayed in the same room until burial, sometimes for days. During heat waves, decomposition happened fast. You could actually hear bodies pop. Families would cover them with cloth soaked in herbs or vinegar-soaked rags. But nothing truly masked the smell of decay. It seeped into the floorboards, the linens, the walls. Ghosts didn't haunt houses. Smells did. And because people lived in such close quarters, if one person got sick, everyone else could practically smell their fate arriving. No isolation rooms, no quarantine protocols that worked, no Lysol. Just the slow march of symptoms across your family like a very moist domino chain. First the coughing, then the fever, then the groaning, then the part where someone's skin changes colour. And all of it accompanied by the soundtrack of dripping oozing and an air that could punch you. Even medical remedies had their own scent horrors. Some poultices were made of cow dung, garlic and vinegar. Some wrapped open sores with fermented bread or chewed onion pulp. Others used urine, human or animal, as a disinfectant. If you were lucky, the stench of the treatment overpowered the stench of the illness. If not, they mingled in your nostrils and left you questioning the point of survival. Let's not ignore the psychological damage. Living surrounded by the smell of death wasn't just gross, it was traumatic. The constant reminder that everyone was sick or about to be sick, or very recently had been sick. It seeped into the soul. People stopped caring, stopped noticing. You didn't hold your breath when walking past a sick house. You just sighed, scratched your lice-ridden scalp and hoped your next cough wasn't the cough. Now in the modern world you sniff spoiled milk and panic. You light candles to cover pet odour. You call in sick for a headache. Meanwhile, your medieval ancestor sat in a room with 2 dying siblings, a rat chewing his blanket and a wound that smelled like burnt onions and despair, and said, "Guess I'll chop wood today." Perspective, folks. So if you enjoy breathing through your nose without crying thank plumbing, thank medicine, thank soap, and thank the miracle of a world where the scent of cinnamon means cookies, not a desperate attempt to drown out corpse stench. Next, we leave the festering patient and head to the mouths of the era, because nothing says I love history like medieval dentistry. If you think a trip to the dentist today is scary, imagine dentistry with no anaesthesia, no sterilisation and no dental school. That's not a bad day at the office. That's every day in medieval Europe. You didn't go to the dentist, you went to the guy with the strongest grip and the least sympathy. Tooth pain was a one-way ticket to the worst day of your life, and survival was purely optional. Let's start with the tools. There were no sleek metal instruments, no soothing playlists, no mouthwash. Instead, there were iron pliers, rusted hooks and wooden mallets. That's right, mallets. If a tooth wouldn't come out, they broke it, into pieces, and then dug around for the roots. No gloves, no antiseptic, just brute force and a cloth to bite down on while you screamed into the void. Who performed these procedures? Not dentists. Dentistry wasn't a profession. It was a hobby for barbers and blacksmiths. Literally. The same guy who trimmed your beard or shod your horse might yank your molars after lunch. They had no training beyond don't hit the eyeball. And if you died of infection a week later, well, maybe you shouldn't have annoyed the gods with that sinful chewing. And let's be clear, people needed dental work. Their diets were brutal bread baked with stone fragments, meat cooked, until leathery zero understanding of sugar decay. Teeth cracked, gums bled, cavities rotted so deep they could echo. By the time someone noticed a tooth problem, it was already a horror show. Swollen faces, foul-smelling breath, pus leaking from the gums, a smile that could stop traffic in a bad way. Toothpaste. Cute idea. Most people clean their teeth with a cloth, some salt and sheer willpower. If you were fancy, you might use crushed herbs or burned eggshells. If you were royalty, you might brush with wine or vinegar. But the results were still awful. Teeth blackened, loosened, and eventually fell out. By 30, most people had a mouth like a ruined fence full of gaps, splinters, and shame. And what about bad breath? It wasn't bad, it was weaponized. Halitosis in the Middle Ages could strip paint. If someone leaned in too close during conversation, you risked unconsciousness. People chewed parsley or fennel seeds to mask the stench, but it was like spraying perfume on a dumpster fire. Medieval breath wasn't a quirk, it was a curse. You didn't whisper secrets, you launched them with force. Now, when a tooth went bad, and they always did, you had 2 options: suffer in silence or get it yanked. No fillings, no root canals, no polite numbing gel, just open your mouth and try not to bite the guy pulling. Extractions were done in public squares, often with a crowd. Because nothing says good entertainment like watching someone have their teeth removed with the enthusiasm of a drunk carpenter. And don't think it ended there. If the tooth shattered mid-extraction, and it often did, the remaining fragments were sometimes left in. Why? Because the barber couldn't reach them, or didn't feel like digging round inside your mouth half an hour while you kicked the furniture over. So you walked home with broken enamel, exposed nerves, and a mouth that felt like it had been cursed by 7 witches and a confused blacksmith. Abscesses were worse. If infection spread deep into the jaw, your face would swell until you looked like a lopsided potato. The solution: lancet with a knife or a heated poker. And then this is real. People would press live frogs or pigeons against the swelling, believing the animals would draw out the poison. If you've never held a live bird against your face while screaming, have you even lived? Dental prosthetics existed, sort of. Some people tied animal teeth into their mouths with gold wire. Others carved wooden teeth. If you were really rich, you might get a transplant from a poor person. They'd yank a healthy tooth from some peasant and shove it into your bleeding gums. And because there was no concept of organ rejection, infections happened constantly. But hey, at least your smile looked decent for the 5 days before you died of sepsis. Let's take a quick detour into toothworms. Yes, toothworms. People believed cavities were caused by tiny worms living in your teeth, nibbling from the inside. You know, because of the pain and the little holes. It made sense in a horrifying, superstitious way. Some even claimed to see them wiggling after extractions. Spoiler, those were nerves or bits of tissue, but medieval science said worms. Definitely worms. So they burned herbs or poured oil in the mouth to smoke them out. Results were not great. And what did medieval people do about jaw pain or TMJ nothing? You just lived with it, or you drank heavily. Alcohol was the only anaesthetic available to commoners. You'd slam a pint of ale or wine before the procedure, hoping to dull the agony. If that didn't work, they poured it into your mouth while pulling. Because nothing says sterile technique like a double IPA poured over your gums mid-extraction. It gets worse. In some regions, dental issues were considered divine punishment. Toothache meant you had sinned. So instead of seeing a dentist, you saw a priest. Confess. Pray. Maybe light a candle to St. Apollonia, the patron saint of dental pain, who, fun fact, had her teeth ripped out by angry Romans. That's the level of dental trauma we're working with here. Even the saints had flashbacks. And if you think tooth loss meant the end of pain, think again. Gaps led to jaw misalignment, which led to more pain, more grinding, and more infection. Eating became a battlefield. Chewing meat was an extreme sport. Soup was salvation. And smiling a rare event, because no one wanted to see your 6 teeth wobbling like gravestones after an earthquake. By the late Middle Ages, some apothecaries tried mixing herbs to cure dental pain: clove oil, crushed pepper vinegar. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it melted your mouth. People were so desperate for relief they tried anything: animal fat, hot coals, dried dung, opium, if they could afford it. Medieval dental care was basically a long, shrieking experiment in what didn't work, and yet people survived. Somehow. They chewed with the side that hurt less. They slurped broth. They accepted pain as part of life. And when it got too much, they tied a rope around a loose tooth and slammed the door, or let a friend punch it out. Because when you live in a world of lice plague and rotting meat, what's one more tooth on the floor? So next time you hear that soothing hum at the dentist's office, smell that minty fresh polish, and feel your numb cheek start to sag, say, thank you. Thank you to science, to fluoride, to people who don't pull your teeth in the town square while juggling scissors. And thank your dentist for having an actual degree and not just a hammer and a dream. Coming up, it's time to visit the law. Spoiler: justice in medieval towns had less to do with fairness and more to do with public humiliation iron devices and the occasional accidental decapitation. Let's begin with this timeless truth: humans have always been vain. Even in the Middle Ages, when people were literally living in poop fog, swarmed by lice, and praying not to die of bread mould, fashion mattered. Beauty mattered. And so did skin tone, hairstyle, and body odour, though, in very weird ways. Because when your society runs on superstition, spoiled fat, and zero dermatology beauty tips, get real disturbing real fast. Take skincare. Want a radiant pale complexion? Congratulations, you've just volunteered to smear lead on your face. That's right. Many medieval cosmetics were laced with white lead to give the wearer that fashionable "I'm definitely dying" porcelain look. The sicker you looked, the sexier you were. Pale skin meant you didn't work in the fields. It also meant you might drop dead mid-conversation. But hey, priorities. And it wasn't just lead. Arsenic made appearances in face creams too. Because nothing says natural glow like a slow internal poisoning. These substances caused flaking, bleeding, and permanent skin damage, but people powered through. You think TikTok skincare trends are dangerous? Imagine exfoliating with vinegar-soaked salt and chalk dust, then following up with mercury foundation. A single sneeze could take your whole face off. Want to reduce wrinkles? Easy. Rub animal fat on your cheeks, specifically goose fat if you're posh. Not only did it smell like a haunted barn, it also attracted flies like pilgrims to a holy relic. But it gave the skin a shiny, dewy appearance, like you'd just been kissed by death itself. Combine it with crushed herbs or crushed pearls, and you had a medieval face mask that doubled as pest control. Now let's discuss blush. Rosy cheeks were all the rage, but without Sephora, folks had to improvise. Popular options included crushed beetles, red ochre, or pig's blood. You'd dab it onto your cheeks with a feather or your fingers after scraping off any existing skin with a cloth or a knife. Yes, a knife. Because nothing says date ready like applying your makeup with a weapon. Lips were tinted using elderberries wine or sometimes mercury sulfide. Yes, mercury again. Somehow people looked at a shiny red toxic rock and thought, I want this on my mouth. The result? A luscious, trembling smile with a side of neurological damage. If you weren't drooling by the time you finished applying, were you even trying? Let's move to hair. Long, fair and silky was the medieval dream, but shampoo wasn't really a thing. Most people washed their hair with lye-soaked vinegar or just water if they were lucky. And lice constant, so women combed with special fine-toothed wooden combs that doubled as pest removal tools. If your hair didn't smell like fermented oats, were you even fashionable? To lighten hair, women applied urine, yes, warm fermented urine, sometimes mixed with saffron or herbs. They'd soak their hair and sit in the sun until it dried. Blondes were considered ethereal angelic, or just extremely dedicated to peeing in jars. Bonus tip: stale urine was stronger. So if it really stank, it really worked. That's just science. Men had it no better. They too used fat-based pomades and strange concoctions to shape their hair and beards. One popular styling cream combined pig lard ash and rose petals. The result? A nice greasy sheen and the lingering smell of a burned bakery. If your beard didn't drip during meals, you were underdressed. And now eyebrows, or the lack of them. In some periods, plucked eyebrows were considered ultra-chic, especially among nobility. Some women even remove their eyelashes to create a more pure forehead, because obviously nothing says grace like looking mildly surprised forever. They plucked them out with tweezers or burned them off with hot ash. And let me tell you, nothing enhances your aura like scorched eyelids. Oh, and don't forget perfume, or more accurately scent cover. People didn't smell good. They just tried to smell less bad. Perfumes were made from crushed flowers, herbs, animal musk, or brace yourself. Ambergris, which is whale vomit. Expensive whale vomit. If you could afford that, congratulations. You were the king of the sewage parade. But for the common folk, they stuffed lavender in their sleeves, carried scented balls of resin, or wore pouches of rosemary around their necks. Some even shoved herbs up their noses during festivals or executions, not for style, for survival. Because the people around you reeked, and if they got too close, your nose might file a resignation letter. Teeth, as you might imagine, weren't particularly photogenic. Whitening was attempted using ashes, crushed charcoal, or even brick dust. Effective, marginally. Safe, absolutely not. Most people just tried to not show their teeth. Smiling with your mouth closed became an art, especially when a third of your teeth were either black, missing, or screaming. And nails. You didn't paint them, you cleaned them. Rarely. If you were upper class, you might oil them with animal fat or buff them with cloth. If you were a peasant, they were just another place for dirt and disease to collect. No one judged you for it. The plague was a bigger problem than cuticle care. Let's talk fashion, because no matter how smelly or infested you were, if you dressed the part, society looked the other way. Fashion was pain, literally. Corsets squeezed ribs. Shoes had absurdly long toes stuffed with wool and regret. Men wore doublets so tight they couldn't bend at the waist, and everyone layered wool linen and sometimes leather even in summer. If you didn't faint from heat stroke, you looked great. And then there were the hats. Oh, the hats. Pointy, fluffy, coiled like cinnamon buns or towering like a personal steeple hats were status symbols. The bigger the hat, the bigger your ego and possibly your lice colony. They were adorned with feathers, fur, and sometimes live birds. Not kidding. People wore live birds on their heads for fashion, and if one pooped, that just meant it was fresh. The ultimate medieval beauty hack. Don't be poor. Because if you were rich, you could afford the illusion of cleanliness. Servants washed your hands, changed your linens, ground your makeup, and replaced your lice-infested bedding. You could afford a personal bath, an herb-filled room, and enough perfume to choke a goat. Meanwhile, peasants rubbed goose fat on their faces and hoped for the best. So the next time you see someone on Instagram talking about natural beauty hacks, just know it could be worse. You could be crushing beetles for blush. You could be whitening your teeth with brick powder. You could be bleaching your hair with fermented urine in a field while praying the lice don't crawl into your brain. Medieval beauty wasn't about looking good. It was about looking less diseased than usual while inhaling whale puke and ducking under your own hat. And somehow, despite the filth, the danger and the sheer grossness of it all, people still tried. They painted, they preened, they perfumed. Because even in a world of rats and boils, vanity refused to die. But now, dear reader, we must leave the world of fashion and vanity and enter the courtroom. Next up, justice served cold in iron shackles with public humiliation for dessert. You know the phrase, you are what you eat? Well, in the Middle Ages, that basically meant you were 20% bread, 30% salted mystery meat and 50% digestive trauma. Food wasn't just bland, it was medievally cursed. It either tasted like wet stone or had been dead long enough to develop a personality. Most of it was overcooked, underspiced, or possibly still moving. If you walked away from dinner without immediate intestinal regret, it was considered fine dining. Let's start with bread. Ah, yes, the backbone of the medieval diet. But don't imagine a golden-crusted artisan sourdough. Think hard, grey slabs that could double as construction material. Flour was often mixed with ground beans, acorns, or even tree bark during shortages. Some bakers even padded out their flour with chalk lime or brace yourself ground animal bones. That's right. You thought you were eating bread. You were actually chewing a medieval jawbreaker loaded with calcium and sorrow. And you better hope it was your own jaw that did the chewing, because those loaves could chip teeth like they were designed by a dentist with anger issues. Bread was sometimes so coarse people softened it in ale just to avoid breaking a molar, which was convenient because ale was usually the only thing safe to drink anyway. Softening food with alcohol wasn't just lazy, it was a survival technique. Now let's talk meat. Assuming you weren't already a vegetarian out of sheer survival instinct, meat was a gamble. Fresh meat had a 12-second window before it went bad. Without refrigeration, it spoiled fast. So what did people do? They covered the rot. Spices, sauces, and smoking techniques weren't just for flavour. They were camouflage. If the meat smelled weird, just add more cloves. If it looked green, boil it until it gave up. And let's not even get started on how animals were butchered. Hygiene hilarious. Butchers often hacked up carcasses in open-air markets with flies, rats, and barefoot children underfoot. Blood soaked the ground. Dogs licked the cutting blocks. Some cuts were so old they had achieved the texture of medieval leather. You didn't ask, is this fresh? You asked, will this kill me now or later? Dairy wasn't much better. Milk turned within hours. Cheese came in two options, rock hard or dripping. Eggs were collected when someone remembered to check the hen, which could mean today or sometime this week. Ever cracked open a medieval egg and found a half-formed chick? If not, congratulations, you're luckier than most. And butter only for the rich. The poor just ate what was called dripping, which was literally fat that dripped off meat. That's not a culinary term. That's a dare. Fruits and vegetables existed, but not in the Instagram-worthy way we know them now. Apples were often wormy, pears were gritty. and leafy greens were boiled until they resembled wet paper. Most veggies were seen as peasant food or worse, animal fodder. Nobles avoided them unless they were heavily spiced or buried in pie crust. Speaking of which, pies were the medieval version of shove everything in and pretend it's edible. Pies were less about flavour and more about containment. Got leftover pork, a rotting pigeon, half a pear and some herbs. Into the crust it goes. Voila, dinner. Some pies even included live birds inside just to startle the diner with flair. It was like dinner theatre, except instead of applause you got feathers in your ale. And the crust sometimes inedible. It was called a coffin for a reason. It sealed the contents like food-grade tombstone. Soup and pottage, thick, stewy messes of whatever they had were the peasant staples. These were cooked in the same pot over the same fire with the same ingredients for days. Literally. The pot never got emptied. It just got refilled. What's for dinner? Tuesday, Wednesday, and a piece of Thursday. The longer it sat, the more flavourful it got. Or the more fermented. Same difference. If you were lucky enough to be rich, you had access to spices, saffron, cinnamon, pepper, cloves. These weren't used for subtle flavour. They were dumped in like confetti to bury the rot. A noble dish might smell like a perfume factory on fire and taste like cinnamon-dusted regret. But it impressed guests, and more importantly, it didn't actively crawl off the plate, which was always a plus. And then there were fast days. The church mandated dozens of religious fasting days where meat and animal products were forbidden, so people ate fish, lots and lots of bad fish, dried cod, salted herring, pickled eel, fish that had been transported overland with no ice then sat in a cellar for a week. Fish Friday wasn't a celebration, it was a threat. The wealthy faked their way through fasting with culinary loopholes. Beavers, for instance, were considered fish because they had tails and lived in water. So yes, people ate beaver in the name of holiness. If it swam, floated, or vaguely resembled something aquatic, it was fair game. Even barnacle geese, a species people thought grew on trees, were considered fish. Because logic in the Middle Ages was basically close enough. Sweets rare and horrifying. Honey was the main sweetener. Sugar, when it appeared, was a luxury reserved for nobility. Most desserts consisted of nuts, dried fruits, and hard tooth-breaking confections that doubled as medieval weapons. Candied rose petals, marzipan shaped like hedgehogs, or weird jellied meats, all treats for those with strong teeth and stronger stomachs. And table manners, barely a concept. People ate with their fingers, shared trenchers, flat pieces of stale bread used as plates, and wiped their mouths on whatever was closest sleeves, tablecloths, the dog. Double dipping, tried double handfuls. Forks didn't catch on until centuries later. You grabbed, you gnawed, you tried not to make eye contact with the roasted pig's face staring at you from across the board. And if you got food poisoning, which was often, you just lay there moaning into your blanket, praying. The bile would stop rising. There was no Pepto, no charcoal pills, just herb superstition and maybe a priest. People blame the stars, bad air, or the fact that you probably sinned a little too hard last week. It couldn't be the sausage you found under your bed, obviously. But despite all of this, despite the rot, the risk and the rat nibbles, people loved to eat. Feasts were the highlight of social life. Weddings, religious festivals, coronations. Every excuse led to tables creaking under the weight of meats, bread, and questionable pies. People drank, laughed, stuffed their faces, and ignored the stomach cramps building in the background. Because in a world where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed today's food, even terrible food was something to celebrate. So the next time you bite into a cold slice of pizza and think, ugh, not fresh, just remember somewhere in history a man chewed on bark flour bread dipped in goat fat while a maggot fell off his pork pie. And he said with a toothless grin, it's not bad. Up next, let's wash it all down with a visit to medieval law and order where crime didn't just get punished. It got humiliated, bloodied, and occasionally roasted. Imagine walking into a doctor's office with a sore throat and walking out missing half a pint of blood, a pigeon strapped to your foot, and a herbal compress made of cow dung taped to your forehead. Congratulations, you've just experienced the miracle of medieval medicine, a practice where leeches were therapists, bile was personality, and pus was practically a love language. The Middle Ages weren't a time of healing. They were a high-stakes guessing game played with sharp objects and bad Latin. The core of medical science at the time was the four humus theory, a dazzlingly wrong system inherited from ancient Greece. Your body, they believed, was made up of blood phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Too much of one. That's your problem, a headache. Obviously, your black bile's in a mood. Depression. That's just melancholy, literally too much black bile. Instead of treating symptoms, medieval doctors played a never-ending game of which bodily fluid is misbehaving today. This meant that the number one treatment, the medical superstar of the era, was bloodletting. You had too much blood. You always had too much blood. Didn't matter if you were vomiting, fainting, or already pale as a ghost, more blood out, more balance. Barbers? Yes, barbers would slice your vein open and catch the red stuff in a bowl. Want to go deluxe? They'd use leeches. They didn't sterilize anything. And if you bled too much and died, well, clearly your blood was already bad. Duh. Leeches weren't just a one-trick pony. These slimy little vampires were used for everything from headaches to hemorrhoids. They were placed on foreheads, ankles, behind ears, anywhere a doctor thought they might do good work. And while modern medicine has weirdly found some actual use for leeches, in medieval times it was less about science and more about hope mixed with blind trust in nature's creepiest squish. If you didn't get bled, you might be prescribed an enema, because clearly what your flu needed was a jug of lukewarm wine poured up your rear. Enemas were considered cleansing, and were administered with long reusable metal syringes. Pause. Let that image haunt you. They reused them. No soap. No boiling. Just rinse and repeat, preferably not on the same patient in the same hour. Surgical tools, if you can call them, that looked more like torture devices. Amputation saws, trepanation drills to literally drill holes in your skull and let out demons' forceps and iron hooks. All unwashed. All wildly misused. There were no anaesthetics. You were either drunk unconscious or tied to a table with four guys holding you down while you screamed your soul into the afterlife. And afterwards, you got a rag soaked in vinegar, a pat on the head, and maybe a slice of bread. Infection, of course, followed most procedures like a loyal dog. But medieval healers didn't understand bacteria. They blamed bad air curses, demons, or a neighbour who gave you a weird look. To combat infection, they applied poultices made from dried dung, old wine, mashed onions, or moss from a church wall. Some treatments involved placing a dead toad on the wound. Honestly, it was less medicine, more necromancy with snacks. Let's not forget urine diagnosis, a serious and widespread diagnostic tool. Doctors kept colour charts and sniffed, tasted, or observed your pee in glass bottles. If it was too yellow, too cloudy, too sweet-smelling, or moved weirdly when stirred with a stick, it meant something. Not necessarily something correct, but something. If your urine changed colour when held up to the light, you had 3 days to live. Unless Mercury was in retrograde, then maybe 5. And speaking of astrology, medieval medicine loved the stars. Doctors consulted horoscopes before performing surgery or bloodletting. I can't lance your boil until Jupiter clears Aquarius, they might say. If your lucky planet was Saturn and it clashed with your rising bile sign, you were screwed. Healing depended less on biology and more on whether your birth chart was in a good mood. For dental issues, which were frequent and horrifying, the medical advice was often pull it out and scream into a towel. But sometimes they tried to save you with burnt herbs, urine rinses, or dead mouse paste. That's not slang. They'd crush a mouse into a pulp, mix it with ash or honey, and apply it to your aching gums. If that didn't work, it meant the devil was in your mouth. Time to call a priest, or a dentist with very poor boundaries. Mental health. Oh, you sweet summer child. Anxiety, depression, or hallucinations were seen as either demonic possession or punishment from God. The cure, isolation, prayer, flagellation, self-beating, or in some cases drilling a hole in your head to let the spirits out. No one asked how your childhood was. They just assumed your soul had been hijacked by Beelzebub and reached for the nearest sharp stick. Women's health was its own category of medieval disaster. Midwives were trusted by common folk, but official medicine saw women as leaky and moist creatures controlled by the moon and hysteria. Hysteria literally came from the Greek word for uterus, and treatments range from herbs to chastity belts to exorcisms. Some doctors believed a wandering womb could travel around a woman's body like a confused hamster, causing headaches and bad decisions, the cure scent therapy. They'd wave foul-smelling herbs near her nose to drive the uterus back down to where it belonged. Science and childbirth. That was war. No sterile rooms, no trained professionals, just screaming candles, crossed fingers, and a midwife armed with boiling water and sharp scissors. Complications often meant death for the baby, the mother, or both, and C-sections performed posthumously because the mother was usually already dead. If you survived childbirth more than once, you were practically a superhero. Herbal medicine was the most logical corner of this bloody circus. People used plants like yarrow, sage, lavender, and mint to ease pain or treat wounds, and sometimes they actually worked. But because no one understood dosage or interactions, people often swallowed way too much and hallucinated for a week. Healing sometimes looked like lying naked in a cabbage field screaming about angels. Medieval side effects may include visions, vomiting, and involuntary poetry. Hospitals, when they existed, were mostly run by monks and nuns. They offered shelter soup prayer and maybe some herbal tea. There were no operating rooms, no pharmacies, and absolutely no expectations of actual recovery. People went to hospitals to die more politely. Beds were shared. Sheets were never washed. If the rats didn't get you, the guy next to you coughing up blood would. Despite all this, medieval people tried. They cared. They burned incense to cleanse the air. They planted herb gardens. They wrote medical books with wild, confident nonsense. One recipe for healing boils involved honey onion bile and the dried gall of a cat, because when in doubt add bile, or cat, or honey. If it was sticky, sacred, or slightly gross, someone had tried it at least once. Eventually the Renaissance started to crack things open. Dissections became legal, sort of scholars began questioning humours and medical schools popped up. But even then, bad ideas took centuries to die. People still believed in touching for the king's evil, where royalty laid hands on you to cure scrofula. Because nothing screams scientific breakthrough like a king blessing your neck lump with his divine fingers. So next time you get a paper cut and reach for a band-aid, remember your ancestors might have slapped a dead frog on it, bled you for imbalance and buried you by sunrise. Because medicine back then wasn't about healing. It was about not making things worse. And most of the time, they failed. Next up, let's get judicial, where innocent until proven guilty meant very little, and trial by ordeal included holding hot irons, dunking witches, and hoping your skin didn't boil off. Love in the Middle Ages was a curious beast. It was rarely about poetry, long walks through the mead field, or gazing into each other's plague-weary eyes. It was more about livestock land and whether your uncle approved. Romance came with conditions, sometimes dowries, sometimes goats, and frequently a mild case of scurvy, because nothing makes courtship more thrilling than bleeding gums and vitamin C deficiency. Let's be clear, marriage was rarely about love. It was a business deal sealed with handshakes and sheep. Your future spouse might be chosen before you hit puberty, and if you were noble, you might not even meet them until the wedding, when you realised your husband had 3 teeth and your wife could arm wrestle a monk. Surprise. You're legally bound forever, or until one of you dies of gout, which statistically would be soon. That's not to say love didn't exist. It did, just usually outside of marriage. Affairs were the original side hustle. If your arranged spouse was more wooden than the family furniture, you might find yourself drawn to the stable boy, or the lady-in-waiting who smelled only slightly of garlic. Courtly love was all the rage in literature, noble knights writing sad poems for unavailable women. Basically medieval Facebook crushes, but with more chainmail. And speaking of hygiene, attraction was often an act of willpower. People didn't bathe often. Teeth were rotting by age 20. Hair was stiff with oil and sometimes crawling. So when someone said, "My love burns for you," it might have been literal. They probably had syphilis, or fleas, or both. Love was blind, but more importantly, love had no sense of smell. Dating culture as we know it was non-existent. You didn't grab a drink or catch a movie. You maybe exchanged glances at the market while your parents bartered over pigs. Or you danced together once at a feast before being shoved into opposite arranged marriages. And flirting often involved a gift of food, a serenade under a window, or if you were feeling especially forward, not spitting in their direction. Sex education, don't even ask. Most people's first lesson was their wedding night, guided by instinct panic, and maybe a priest outside the door shouting encouragement. For women it came with dire warnings about modesty, virginity, and possibly being cursed by a jealous crone if you enjoyed it too much. For men it came with expectations, pressure, and no real understanding of anatomy. The result? Confusion, disappointment, and about 14 children. Now, if you were a woman, your job was to be desirable, but not too desirable. If you were too pretty, people assumed you were a witch. If you were too ugly, people assumed you were a punishment. Walk the line. Smile, but not with teeth. Be modest, but fertile. Don't be loud. Don't be silent. Don't have opinions unless your husband agrees with them in advance. Also, try not to die in childbirth. That really killed the mood. And men weren't exactly Casanovas either. Most were covered in mud, missing key pieces of dental real estate, and had the conversational skills of a brick. Your best case scenario was a guy who didn't smell like fermented goat and could go 5 minutes without referencing crop yield. Still, he might write you a poem, or stab a rival, or give you a dried apple from last winter and call it a token of affection. Be still, your lice-ridden heart. If you were poor, your wedding was usually held at the church door. No feast, no gown, just a handshake, a mumbled vow, and maybe a stolen kiss before returning to your hay pile of a home. If you were rich, it was an event feasting dancing alliances forming like chess pieces in silk. The bride's family paid the dowry, the groom's family provided the wine, and somewhere in between the bride tried to remember the name of the man she was about to spend her scurvy-filled years with. Contraception existed, sort of. People used herb sponges soaked in wine or complex rituals that involved standing on one foot while reciting psalms. Effectiveness. Questionable. But fear of pregnancy outside marriage was real. Women who conceived out of wedlock were often shamed, punished, or worse. Men. They were usually told, "Well, that's just boys being boys." Equality was more of a distant dream than a medieval policy. But let's not forget the monastic romances. Nuns and monks weren't robots. Many entered the religious life not out of devotion, but because their family couldn't afford marriage, which led to lonely, confused young people writing love letters to each other across abbey walls. Some monasteries banned all contact between the sexes. Others turned a blind eye. Forbidden love flourished under stained glass and vow-breaking. Move over Romeo and Juliet. Meet brother Elfric and sister Gundalina. Queer relationships. They existed, always have, but they were hidden, dangerous and whispered. Officially, the church condemned homosexuality. Unofficially, so did your neighbours. Getting caught meant punishment, exile, or execution. So queer love was coded, expressed in poetry, careful touches, or lifelong companionship passed off as very good friendship. They survived where they could, in shadows, in silence, in stolen moments. As for public affection, it depended on your station. Nobles might kiss a lady's hand, offer a flower, or write embarrassingly bad love ballads. Peasants, they had fewer rules. A quick grope in the hayloft, a whispered proposal behind the ox shed, or a lusty round of green grow the rushes at the tavern. Romance was less about aesthetics, more about timing. and whether the pig was watching. Despite the chaos, some couples genuinely loved each other. They laughed, they worked together, they raised their kids and prayed not to bury them too soon. Love grew in kitchens, in fields and under leaky roofs. It was quiet, tired, imperfect and real. Not the stuff of troubadour ballads, but something stronger. It endured fleas, poverty and plague, and occasionally it even outlived the goats. So yes, love existed. It just wore dirtier clothes and had fewer teeth. It smelled like cabbage. It came with 14 in-laws and a dowry of 3 geese. But it laughed, it clung, and it hoped. Because even in the stink and sickness, the broken bread and broken bed, someone always reached out their grubby, calloused hand and said, "You. I choose your lice." Up next, the workplace of nightmares where the jobs were dirty, the bosses were cruel, and OSHA wouldn't be invented for another 700 years. If you think modern police departments have problems, allow me to introduce you to medieval law enforcement, a ragtag band of amateurs, drunkards, part-time criminals, and the occasional goat owner who got promoted after catching someone stealing turnips. There was no uniform, no badge, no training academy, just a stick, a shouted accusation, and the unwavering belief that yelling loudly enough made you legally correct. Justice didn't just stink metaphorically, it reeked in a very literal sense. Let's begin with the basics. Most towns didn't have a police force. They had constables or watchmen, usually local men appointed by the lord the church or whoever had the largest sword and the fewest teeth. These guys weren't paid. They weren't even trained. They were just expected to walk around at night, yell all's well, even if it wasn't, and occasionally arrest someone if they weren't too drunk to remember which end of the stick was for hitting. The watchman's gear: a lantern, if he could afford one, a staff, basically a broom with authority, and maybe a horn to blow in emergencies, which was often just him falling in a ditch. Their main job was to deter crime by existing loudly. If someone was breaking into your shop, the watchman's strategy was to hope they didn't notice him, and then report it the next morning, assuming he remembered. If you were caught committing a crime, you didn't get cuffed and read your rights. You got dragged by rope, hair or ear to the nearest holding cell. And by holding cell, I mean a filthy wooden box with no ventilation, no toilet, and enough rats to start a jazz band. You didn't stay there long, mostly because the smell killed half your will to live. Justice moved quickly, if not fairly. Courtrooms weren't much better. Trials were public, loud, and fueled by superstition beer and people with vendettas. The judge might be a noble, a priest, or a merchant with a grudge and spare afternoon. Legal proceedings were mostly shouting matches, evidence optional, witnesses easily bribed. And if you were a foreigner, poor or weird-looking, congratulations, you were already guilty. Bonus points if someone had a dream about you stealing their chickens. And the laws? Boy, there were hundreds, often conflicting, deeply strange and frequently enforced based on mood. You could be fined for wearing the wrong hat, walking through the town square with muddy boots, or playing dice on a Tuesday. Meanwhile, stealing bread could get your hand chopped off unless it was blessed bread, in which case it was also a sin and you were now double doomed. If the court couldn't decide your guilt, they'd let God sort it out. Enter the era of trial by ordeal, where you proved your innocence by surviving something horrific. You might be asked to stick your hand in boiling water, or carry a hot iron bar, or be tied and tossed into a river to see if you floated, which meant guilty, or sank, which meant innocent and also dead. If you survived, they figured you were innocent, or a witch. And speaking of witches, medieval law enforcement loved a good witch hunt. Any woman with herbal knowledge, a pet cat, or the audacity to speak her mind was fair game. She might be accused of bewitching milk, summoning storms, or, my personal favourite, making a neighbour's pig walk backwards. The punishment, torture, public shaming, and possibly a bonfire. Law and order medieval style. Let's talk punishment. There was no jail time. That would have required space. Instead, justice was public and painful. You might be whipped in the town square, shackled in stocks, while children threw rotten food at you, or paraded around with signs like thief or liar hung around your neck. If your crime was serious, or if the crowd was bored, you'd lose a body part. Hands, ears, tongues. All fair game. And yes, they did it without anesthesia. Surprise. And the execution's a full-blown civic event. People brought snacks. Kids climbed onto barrels for a better view. A guy being hanged wasn't just a criminal, he was Tuesday afternoon entertainment. And the executioners, not exactly professionals. They were often drunks, former criminals, or both. If they missed the neck and hit the shoulder, oh well, try again. Crowd goes wild. Probably some guy selling soup next to the gallows. One of the most infamous punishments was the pillory, a wooden contraption that locked your head and hands in place so townspeople could mock you, spit on you, or pelt you with vegetables. It was designed less to rehabilitate and more to humiliate. You didn't leave the pillory a changed man. You left with bruises, shame, and cabbage in your hair. But let's not forget the fine system, because nothing says justice like financial extortion. Nobles could buy their way out of almost anything. Murder. That'll be 40 sheep and a half-acre of barley. Assault, 10 silver coins, and a stern talking to. Meanwhile, a peasant who stole bread got whipped until he couldn't stand. The scales of justice weren't just unbalanced, they were upside down, cracked, and being used to weigh cheese. And while some cities did try to standardise things, like London's rudimentary constabulary, it often devolved into local politics corruption, and guys with power playing God in muddy boots. There were even guilds of informant snitches who got paid to rat out crimes. But they quickly realised that making up crimes was more profitable than reporting real ones. So if you sneezed too hard, someone might accuse you of blowing cursed wind. And for the truly unfortunate, there was branding. That's right. They burned letters into your skin. A T for thief, an F for forger, a B for blasphemer. It wasn't just punishment, it was permanent advertising. You walked around with your crime printed on your face like a medieval Yelp review. 1 star would not trust again. So where were the checks and balances? The oversight, the appeals process? Oh, honey, those came in the form of angels. If you were innocent, surely God would protect you. If not, you probably deserved it. The legal system ran on fear, folklore, and the vague hope that next time the drunk constable wouldn't arrest your goat for loitering. Still, it worked. Kind of. People obeyed the law mostly because they didn't want to be flogged in public or lose a body part to a man with shaky hands and a blunt axe. Justice wasn't blind. It was cross-eyed, unwashed, and held together with superstition and rope. But it was justice. Sort of. So next time you complain about a parking ticket, imagine standing in a wooden box for 6 hours while the town idiot throws turnips at your head. Or losing your ear because someone thought your bread was too round. Suddenly court-ordered community service doesn't sound so bad. Up next, let's clock in and meet the real MVPs of medieval misery, the workers. The diggers, the dung shovelers, the plague cart drivers. Welcome to a labour force powered by sweat, fear, and deeply unrealistic job descriptions. The Black Death didn't just knock politely and enter, it kicked down the door, burned your house down, and made you watch. From 1347 to roughly whenever your entire village was dead, Europe was gripped by a pandemic so merciless it made modern viruses look like mild allergies. The plague didn't discriminate. Nobles, peasants, monks, rats. Everyone got an invitation to the end of the world party, and the dress code was mostly boils. The disease came in multiple horrifying flavours: bubonic, swollen lymph nodes, the size of apples, pneumonic, coughing blood. Like you're auditioning for a horror film in septicemic, your blood liquefies and your skin turns black before you keel over. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no hand sanitizer, just prayer panic, and the occasional attempt to scare the disease away with loud bells and slightly louder weeping. It started with rats, or more accurately the fleas on rats hitching a ride on trading ships. 1 minute everything's fine, the next half your neighbours are oozing and the baker hasn't opened in a week. Soon the town square is quiet, too quiet, except for the coughing, and the bell that tolls for yet another soul, and the guy pushing a cart shouting, "Bring out your dead," like it's a perfectly normal Tuesday. That cart pusher, He was the medieval equivalent of a waste disposal technician, but instead of banana peels and broken jugs, he collected bodies, dozens per day, sometimes hundreds, tossed onto carts like spoiled produce taken to mass graves with names like God's Acre or the Pit of Despair. Burial was no longer a spiritual affair, it was triage with a shovel and a bad attitude. You didn't get a headstone, you got stacked. Entire towns vanished. Gone. Wiped off the map as if they'd never been there. Doors were boarded up with the sick still inside. Clergy died mid-prayer. Physicians fled or dropped dead themselves. Parents abandoned their children. Friends refused to bury each other. Civilization wasn't crumbling. It was evaporating in a cloud of pus panic and medieval denial. And denial there was. With no understanding of bacteria, people turned to their greatest skill blaming things randomly. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and burned alive. Foreigners were chased out of towns. Cats were killed en masse because clearly whiskers spread disease, which, spoiler, made the rat problem worse. Meanwhile, people still crowded into churches thinking maybe their sins had annoyed God into bioterrorism. Speaking of God, religion kicked into overdrive. Flagellants emerged bands of men who whipped themselves in public while chanting and bleeding onto the cobblestones, begging divine forgiveness. They were equal parts penitence and performance art. Maybe if we bleed, God will stop making us bleed from other places. The logic was medieval. The scars were permanent. Medicine hopeless. Doctors wore those now famous plague masks, long beak-like monstrosities stuffed with herbs to block out bad air. They looked like demon birds and smelled like sadness. Their treatments included bloodletting. Again, dried toads still know and advising people to avoid sad thoughts, which during a continent-wide death spiral was solidly unhelpful. Some towns tried quarantine. Venice implemented a 40-day isolation period for ships, hence the word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni. Others built literal walls around infected neighbourhoods and hoped the problem would starve. It didn't. The plague laughed at walls. It went under doors through windows and hitchhiked on your cousin back from market day. Economic collapse followed close behind. With half the workforce dead, crops rotted. Mills stopped grinding and livestock wandered unattended. A cow might walk through your kitchen, and no one would stop it because everyone in the kitchen had died 3 days ago. Bread prices soared. Salt became gold. And suddenly peasants who survived found themselves valuable. Labour shortages turned into unexpected social mobility. Congratulations, death created upward momentum. But don't get too excited, trauma lingered. Survivors didn't throw parties. They threw dirt over mass graves and whispered prayers into cracked pews. Children grew up with no parents. Villages turned into ghost towns. Art got darker. Literature got weirder. People started painting skeletons doing the jig because nothing says coping like dancing with your inevitable demise. Welcome to the dance macabre when the Reaper becomes your DJ. And even after the main wave passed, plague didn't vanish. It came back in cycles every decade or two, like a horrifying party guest that just wouldn't leave. People stopped asking, will we survive, and started asking who's next. The smell of sickness, the fear of touching doorknobs, OK ropes and latches, and the sound of bells in the wind became background noise. Death wasn't a visitor, it was a roommate. Romance suffered too, in case you were wondering. Courtship was hard when your partner might erupt in boils by Thursday. Weddings were postponed. Love letters turned into last wills. I'd die for you wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was just math. And kissing about as safe as licking a plague cart. Art, poetry and music didn't escape either. Graveyard humour bloomed. Manuscripts were covered in skeletons riding goats. Poets wrote about death like it was their ex. O death, thou cruel biter of heels, thou chewer of dreams, thou seriously stop already. Hope was a luxury. Laughter was rebellion, and in many cases completely unintentional. And let's not forget how governments responded poorly mostly. Leaders fled cities, locked gates, and issued absurd advice like avoid exercise and sour food. Some tried mandatory bath bans because obviously cleanliness causes plague. Others taxed the dead. Literally. You had to pay fines before your corpse could be buried. Bureaucracy, as always, remained undefeated. Still, human beings are famously stubborn. They adapted, prayed harder, dug deeper, loved anyway. The plague didn't kill joy entirely, it just made it rare and desperate. A good meal, a miracle. A healthy child, a blessing. A day without new boils, hallelujah. In a world ruled by rot, survival became its own religion. And in the long, slow aftermath, something strange happened. Europe changed. The scarcity of labour gave peasants bargaining power. Feudalism cracked. Wages rose. Towns rebuilt. And medicine finally started asking real questions, like what is pus, and why is there so much of it? A century later, the Renaissance would bloom, but its roots were watered with plague juice and grave dirt. So yes, the plague years were hell, but they were also a turning point, a fever dream that shattered the world and stitched it back together differently. Messier, angrier, weirder, but somehow wiser. Because if humanity could survive that much pus rats and leech-based problem-solving, maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Next up, let's look at the role of religion. Not the comforting kind, but the guilt-ridden, witch-burning, apocalypse-forecasting nightmare fuel that kept medieval sinners tossing and turning. In medieval towns, childhood wasn't a magical time of playgrounds and picture books. It was more like surviving a daily obstacle course of manure, rat plagues and bad parenting. If you made it past age 5, congratulations, you'd already beaten the odds. You were now old enough to work, marry or die of tetanus. Childhood wasn't protected. It was endured preferably without stepping on a rusty nail or being eaten by pigs. The average child didn't have a name for the first few years. Why? Because half of them died. Parents often waited before naming babies in case they didn't stick. Imagine being called the small one for 3 years, until your mum finally decided, all right, this one might survive. Let's call him Godfrey. Love was real but cautious, like feeding a stray dog and not naming it until winter passes. Babies were swaddled so tightly they looked like little wool burritos wrapped from chin to toe in strips of cloth to keep them warm, safe and immobile. This was thought to protect their limbs and souls, though in practice it mostly made diaper changes into a multi-person operation. Speaking of diapers, they didn't really exist. Most infants peed through their swaddles onto straw and then were wiped down with whatever cloth wasn't already in use as a table napkin or plague mask. As kids got older, hygiene didn't improve, it got more interactive. Children played in the streets, which, as we've covered, doubled as sewers, trash heaps and open-air toilets. Mud pies weren't imaginary. They were just actual pies made of mud horse dung and shattered glass from the last tavern brawl. If you licked your fingers after building a castle, you probably needed last rites by sundown. Toys. Imagination did the heavy lifting. Rich kids had carved figurines or wooden hobby horses. Poor kids played with bone sticks or that one rat with a missing leg that seemed friendly. Dolls were made from rags or clay. Bulls were made from pig bladders. Yes, the literal inflated bladder of a pig. Nothing says fun like kicking around a meat balloon while dodging puddles of communal bathwater. Education was a mixed bag. Most children didn't go to school because schools cost money, and literacy didn't help you plough a field or gut a fish. Boys might learn to read if their parents were ambitious, or if they were destined for the clergy where reading meant Latin, which meant headaches. Girls were usually trained in domestic arts, which included sewing, cooking, and how to not die during childbirth by age 16. If you could write your name, you were a genius. If you could read Latin scripture, you were a wizard. Discipline was medieval. Children were expected to obey, be useful, and stay out of the way or else. Corporal punishment wasn't a last resort. It was Tuesday. Parents, priests, teachers, random town officials, Anyone with authority and a stick could educate you with a swift smack. And since child psychology wouldn't be invented for another 600 years, emotional support came in the form of not hitting you today. If you were lucky, your family had enough to feed you. If not, you begged, or worked, or stole. Some kids started labour as early as 5 herding goats, fetching water, spinning wool, or collecting leeches from riverbanks. Not for fun, for the apothecary. If you fell in, no one dove after you. Water was cold, rats could swim, and mourning took time people didn't have. Childhood ended the moment you could carry a bucket or be mistaken for someone who could. And then there was illness. Children were especially susceptible to every disease imaginable. Smallpox, measles, typhoid, plague. If it had a name, it probably visited your house last winter. Fevers could last days. Recovery meant months of weakness, and medical care a spoonful of garlic paste and a prayer to St. Mildred. If that didn't work, there was always bleeding, or boiling, or holy water mixed with chicken blood. Let's talk about fear, because medieval children had plenty. The dark, wolves, fire, the devil, sin, purgatory, being eaten by wild dogs, or worse, being possessed. Parents warned their children that bad behaviour led to eternal torment, not a timeout, actual flames, screaming, demons with forks. Hell was the ultimate boogeyman, and bedtime stories often involved saints being flayed alive. Sweet dreams. Despite all this, children found joy. They laughed, made friends, and even somehow lived. They sang songs, climbed trees if not chopped for firewood, and chased chickens for entertainment. They gossiped, shared secrets, and invented games with rules only they understood. Laughter echoed even through the stink of latrines and disease. Because kids are resilient, even if their shoes were made of wood and they slept next to a pig. Festivals were big fun. Feasting, dancing, and watching Uncle Bertrand dress as a bishop and pretend to bless the town cat. Children got treats if available, like spiced nuts or stale gingerbread shaped like saints. And on certain days, kids even ruled. The Feast of Fools allowed a child to act as bishop for the day leading parades, and generally causing holy chaos. It was one of the few times a child could shout at an adult without consequences, or at least fewer than usual, and some children against all odds thrived. They grew strong, learned trades, made marriages, and raised lice-covered families of their own. They became blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, and priests, or bandits, or soldiers. Life was unpredictable. If you survived your stinky, dangerous, glorious childhood, you entered adulthood already a champion of filth. Let's not sugarcoat it, being a medieval child was rough. Dirty, risky, smelly, and frequently traumatizing. But it was also filled with moments, small, human, hopeful. A warm fire, a crumb of cake, a sibling to laugh with, a mud ball to throw. It wasn't magical, but it mattered. These weren't just tiny peasants. They were survivors, future plague bearers, and eventually old folks yelling at their kids to quit stealing the chicken fat. Next up, let's visit the final resting places of all this medieval misery, because if you think living in the Middle Ages was rough, wait until you see where they buried you. If you lived in a medieval town, you didn't just believe in God, you braced yourself for him. Religion wasn't something you did on Sundays. It was a 24/7 anxiety spiral of sin, penance, fire, and the very real possibility that a demon was watching you pick your nose. Salvation was promised. Damnation was guaranteed unless you followed a confusing system of rituals, relics, and rotting saints that somehow all smelled like incense and old meat. Churches were everywhere, big stone ones, small wooden ones. Chapels crammed between plague houses, and they weren't peaceful sanctuaries. They were the medieval version of social media, loud, controlling, full of judgment, and constantly reminding you how unworthy you were. Bells rang at all hours, priests shouted in Latin no one understood, and the message was always the same: repent. You are disgusting. God is watching, and so is Brother Cedric. Religion was the lens through which people viewed everything. Drought God's wrath, boils God's punishment, bad harvest. The town drunk probably sinned too hard. People didn't question why things happened, they just assumed it was their fault. The church was less a place of comfort, more a spiritual HR department keeping track of your daily failures, and trust me, you had a lot. Sin was categorized, ranked, and tracked like an unholy loyalty program. You lusted. That's 2 Hail Marys. You stole bread, 5 Our Fathers, and a minor public shaming. You imagined punching your landlord. You better fast for 3 days and maybe slap yourself with a thorn branch just to be safe. Confession wasn't private therapy, it was group therapy with mandatory judgment, and a firm reminder that eternal fire was the only alternative. And oh, the relics! Every church claimed to have something, a splinter from the true cross, the toe of a saint, a vial of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, seriously, or the bones of someone holy who definitely didn't look like a goat skeleton covered in perfume. People travelled miles to see these things, crawling on knees, praying for miracles, and occasionally fighting over who got to kiss the bone first. Pilgrimages were less spiritual journeys and more chaotic relic road trips with dysentery. Let's not forget the saints, who were basically the medieval Avengers. You had St. Apollonia for toothaches, St. Blaise for sore throats, and St. Roche if you got the plague. They were like a celestial pharmacy. Except instead of medicine, you got candles, Latin chants, and maybe a side of plague anyway. People prayed to saints the way modern folk search WebMD frantically, with low expectations and high panic. Death and religion were inseparable. Every church had a graveyard, sometimes inside, sometimes underneath. Want to feel close to God, sit next to Uncle Bernard's slowly decomposing coffin while attending Mass. The smell of rot wasn't a problem, it was a reminder. Memento mori. Remember death. Because if there's one thing medieval religion loved, it was reminding you that you'd be a worm buffet soon. The church didn't just own your soul, it owned land, wealth, politics, and your fear. Tithes were required. That meant giving 1/10 of your income to God. Didn't matter if you were starving, God still wanted your onions. Priests weren't always holy men either. Some were illiterate. Some were corrupt. Some fathered more children than they baptized. But challenge the clergy and suddenly you were the devil's intern. And then there was the apocalypse. Everyone was convinced it was right around the corner. A bad storm, a comet, a goose with 3 legs. All signs that the world was ending. The book of Revelation wasn't just scripture, it was breaking news. Preachers shouted warnings, artists painted the Last Judgment in blood and fire, and you poor peasant just tried not to fart in church in case the angels were listening. If you thought the Catholic Church was strict, you clearly hadn't met the flagellants again, those charming self-whippers who roamed town squares punishing themselves so God didn't have to. They were the medieval version of a protest rally, except instead of signs, they had bleeding backs and bad theology. People either joined in or locked their doors. No one liked surprise penance during dinner. And then there was fasting. Lots of fasting, not just Lent. Dozens of holy days where you couldn't eat meat, dairy, or anything that tasted remotely joyful. People got creative. They ate fish that looked suspiciously like chicken. They reclassified beavers as fish because they had tails and swam. That's not a joke, that's ecclesiastical logic. The Lord works in mysterious and very fishy ways. Monasteries were little pockets of religious fervour and occasionally passive-aggressive drama. Monks spent their days praying, copying manuscripts and avoiding eye contact. Silence was often mandatory. So instead of speaking, they'd use hand signals, which sometimes turned into spiritual charades. Is Brother Thomas signalling hunger, or heresy hard to say? Best to just pray and keep copying that Latin you can barely read. Women in religion had fewer options. You could be a nun, which meant sewing, singing, and trying not to make direct eye contact with any sinful thoughts. Or you could be burned as a witch if you read too much or had a pet cat. Nuns were expected to be pious, quiet, and slightly translucent. Their lives were mostly peaceful, until someone accused them of secretly loving cheese too much. In which case, here come the torches, and let's not ignore the artwork. Medieval religious art was intense. Jesus was always suffering, bleeding, or looking mildly disappointed. Saints carried their severed heads like handbags. Demons were drawn like goat-lizard hybrids with trumpet butts. Hell was a big favourite rivers of fire torture devices and naked sinners doing weird gymnastics. You didn't look at religious art to be inspired. You looked at it to shut up and behave. But for all its fire, brimstone and judgment, religion also provided comfort. It was the glue in a world falling apart. It gave structure, rituals, and meaning to suffering. When your cow died, your child coughed blood, or your neighbour spontaneously combusted, religion said, "This hurts, but it matters." Faith wasn't always pretty. It was rarely gentle, but it was present, in every corner, in every prayer, in every whispered plea not to die before harvest. In a world where disease, hunger, and invaders lurked behind every wooden door, religion offered a strange kind of peace, structured fear. Predictable panic. A cosmic scoreboard where if you just suffered correctly you might win eternal happiness. Or at least a break from leeches. So next time you feel guilty for skipping a meeting, remember medieval folks felt guilty for existing. They feared death, damnation, and eating meat on the wrong Wednesday. Their gods watched them sweat in fields and sleep beside corpses. And somehow in all that rot they still believed. Or tried to. Next, let's wrap this medieval nightmare with a final chapter dedicated to the miracle of not dying, a survival guide for anyone who accidentally time-travelled and now has to survive bubonic rats, goat butter, and religious guilt. You made it! 20 chapters deep into the festering, flea-bitten underbelly of medieval town life. You've smelled the toilets, chewed the bone-dusted bread, watched people bleed out in public squares, and probably questioned why anyone would ever want to live through this again. But here we are surrounded by a culture that still wistfully whispers about the simpler times when people lived close to nature. Yes, nature and dysentery. Somehow, between the plague carts and pig-fat face masks, a strange idea took root that the Middle Ages were pure, authentic, unspoiled by modern nonsense. Never mind the rats, or the execution for stealing a potato, or the severe lack of plumbing. People romanticize this era like it was a Netflix cottagecore dream. Spoiler, it was more Parasite core. And the aesthetic came with pus. Let's dissect the nostalgia. People imagine green hills, cobblestone streets, simple clothing, wooden bowls, and community bonfires. They forget the human excrement in those cobblestone cracks, the lice in those simple clothes, the spoiled meat in the wooden bowls, and the fire fueled by burning heretics. Community was strong, sure, because everyone was trapped together in a moist pile of suffering. You either helped each other, or you died smelling like onion poultices. Yes, people lived in tune with the seasons, which is poetic for you probably died during one of them. Spring famine, summer infection, autumn crop failure, winter. Good luck not freezing in your straw and cow dung hut while rats gnaw on your foot. You want seasonal living? Try boiling tree bark for soup because the real food ran out 2 months ago. Let's talk about real food. No processed garbage, right? Just whole honest ingredients from the earth. Like rye bread that gave you hallucinations, or meat aged on a hook next to the town's latrine, or cheese that doubled as self-defense because it was harder than your roof tiles. People didn't eat clean. They ate what hadn't yet attracted crows. And if you think you'd survive on peasant stew, remember half the ingredients were whatever didn't scream when I picked it up. And the close-knit communities, you bet. Everyone knew everything about everyone. That guy with the weird rash gossip for weeks. The woman with 3 miscarriages, clearly cursed. The boy who learned Latin too fast, probably a wizard. There was no privacy, no individuality. Just a constant low-grade paranoia that your neighbour would accuse you of goat sorcery. Again. Love marriage, romance, please. Most relationships were arranged practical and rushed before someone died of a tooth infection. People didn't swipe right. They swiped dowries. A nice moment between spouses meant they didn't hit each other that week. Or maybe he gave her a turnip without swearing. That was romance. That was foreplay. That was also dinner. But they were stronger back then, you say, from your ergonomic chair, sipping filtered oat milk. Maybe. Or maybe they just didn't live long enough to get weak. Infant mortality was sky high. Average life expectancy was somewhere between oops and you're joking. Survive smallpox, starvation, childbirth and political upheaval. Cool, now die from stepping on a rusty nail while collecting eggs. People love to claim life had more meaning. And sure, maybe it did. Because death was always there to remind you how quickly meaning could disappear. You saw it in the streets, at the dinner table, in your brother's coughing fits. Life wasn't poetic. It was survival poetry written in blood, bile and goat fur. It had meaning, yes. Mostly in the form of not dying that day. Even the architecture so admired today for its timeless beauty wasn't designed for comfort. Castles were draughty. Churches echoed with ghosts and the cries of the unbathed. Houses were built from mud sticks and whatever animal had recently stopped moving. Floors were straw. Walls were thin. Privacy was non-existent. If someone farted upstairs, the whole block knew. And let's not forget leisure. You didn't relax. You paused. Leisure was a stolen minute between hauling water and plucking lice from your scalp. Fun was watching a pig race or laughing at the town drunk, or throwing rocks at a man in the stocks. Recreation was violent, or awkward, or smelled like sheep. No one wrote sonnets about me time. They were too busy making sure the roof didn't cave in. People were more connected to the land, sure in the sense that they literally slept on it, farmed it barefoot and died in it. There was no disconnect. You were physically, emotionally and microbially attached to the dirt beneath your hut, which you shared with beetles, and maybe a cousin. So why the rose-coloured goggles? Maybe it's the urge to escape modern noise screens and speed. Maybe the medieval world feels simpler, but simple doesn't mean better. A guillotine is simple, so is dying from diarrhea. The past was not peaceful. It was full of screaming. People screamed a lot. From birth, to marriage, to plague. If anything, the Middle Ages were one long terrifying Yelp review of human endurance. And yet, they endured. Somehow. Through the stink, the blood, the injustice, the boredom, the rats, the sorrow and the shoes made from dead cows. They sang songs, told stories, found love in between boil outbreaks, raised children and hoped for the best, laughed. Probably farted at bad moments, just like us. Human, flawed, filthy, resilient. So still want to live there? Still want to give up electricity for lice? Still think you'd make a great peasant? Be my guest. But bring garlic. You'll need it. And maybe a tetanus shot. Better make that too.